Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. This story takes place 11 years ago when I was just 14 years old. I lived in a small, isolated town tucked away in the mountains of northwest North Carolina, where the fog rolled thick through the valleys every morning, and the nearest grocery store was a 30-minute drive away. My family, my father, mother, and younger brother, had recently moved into an old farmhouse that sat at the end of a winding country road. The move had been sudden, prompted by my father's new job at the lumber mill, and none of us had been prepared for just how remote our new home would be. I loved everything about our new location. Unlike our previous suburban neighborhood with its manicured lawns and chain-link fences, this place felt wild and untamed. Ancient oak trees surrounded our property, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. At night, the darkness was absolute. No streetlights, no passing cars, just the sound of wind moving through the pines and the occasional howl of coyotes in the distance. Our nearest neighbor lived down a long gravel driveway that branched off from our road. His name was Dan, a weathered man in his late 60s who had lived in these mountains his entire life. The driveway to his house stretched nearly half a mile through dense woods, and you couldn't see his home from the main road at all. Dan was a solitary figure, but friendly enough when we encountered him. He had deep-set eyes that seemed to hold secrets about these woods, and his hands were calloused from decades of manual labor. One afternoon, shortly after we'd settled in, Dan stopped by our house with a basket of tomatoes from his garden. As my father talked with him on the porch, Dan mentioned that he owned over 200 acres of forested land that extended deep into the mountains. He told me I was welcome to explore his property, to hunt and hike as I pleased. Growing up in the Southeast, I had always felt a profound connection to the outdoors. It was in my blood, part of my identity. The invitation felt like a gift. Several weeks passed before I worked up the courage to take Dan up on his offer. It was a Saturday morning in early October, and the air had that crisp quality that signals the arrival of autumn. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the mountains in shades of amber and crimson. I decided this would be the perfect day to venture into the woods. My younger brother, who was 10 at the time, was initially resistant to the idea. He preferred video games and television to outdoor activities, and the thought of hiking through rough terrain didn't appeal to him. But I was persistent, and after nearly an hour of convincing, promising him we'd stop at the gas station for candy on the way back, he finally agreed to come along. We informed our parents of our plans over breakfast. My mother was hesitant, her brow furrowing with concern as she looked out the kitchen window toward the tree line. But my father, who had grown up in these very mountains, seemed unconcerned. He simply gave us a strict deadline. We needed to be back home before sunset, which would be around 6:30 p.m. That gave us roughly 8 hours to explore. I gathered my supplies carefully, a pair of binoculars that had belonged to my grandfather, a thick jacket in case the temperature dropped, and most importantly, my blaze orange hunting hat. This wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a safety necessity. Deer hunting season had opened in late September, and these woods would be full of hunters. The bright orange would ensure no one mistook us for game. I also packed 2 bottles of water and some granola bars. We didn't have cell phones back then. Or rather, I didn't. They were just starting to become common among teenagers, but my family couldn't afford one yet. Not that it would have mattered much in these mountains anyway. The cell service was virtually non-existent, with the nearest tower miles away on the other side of the ridge. The walk down Dan's driveway took us 15 minutes. The gravel crunched beneath our boots, and I could hear my brothers breathing behind me, slightly labored from the incline. The driveway was bordered on both sides by thick undergrowth, honeysuckle vines tangled with wild blackberry bushes, creating an impenetrable wall of vegetation. It felt like walking through a tunnel with the canopy overhead blocking out much of the morning sunlight. When we finally reached Dan's house, a modest cabin with a tin roof and a wraparound porch, we found him outside splitting firewood. The rhythmic thunk of his axe against wood echoed through the clearing. He paused when he saw us, wiping sweat from his forehead with a red bandana.
"Going for a hike?"
he asked, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. "Yes, sir," I replied. "Just wanted to let you know we'd be on your property." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line behind his house. "Be careful out there," he said, and something in his tone made me pause. It wasn't just casual advice. There was weight to his words, a warning I didn't fully understand. These woods can be tricky, easy to get turned around. We thanked him and set off into the forest. The terrain was immediately challenging. This part of North Carolina is characterized by steep hills and deep valleys, and within minutes we were climbing at a 45-degree angle, grabbing onto saplings to pull ourselves up. My brother complained constantly, but I was exhilarated. The forest smelled incredible, a mixture of pine sap, damp earth, and decaying leaves. An hour into our hike, after we'd crested a particularly brutal hill, we stumbled upon something unexpected, a narrow path cutting through the undergrowth. It was barely visible, just a slight depression in the forest floor where the vegetation grew less densely, but it was definitely man-made, intentional. "Should we follow it?" my brother asked, his voice uncertain. I hesitated. We'd been bushwhacking through thick brush for the past hour, and the idea of having an actual path to walk on was tempting. Besides, I was curious about where it led. Maybe it would take us to a good hunting spot, or perhaps to some scenic overlook. "Yeah," I said. "Let's check it out." The path wound through the forest in serpentine curves, always maintaining the same general direction, deeper into the mountains, away from civilization. The trees here were different, older, massive pines that must have been growing for a century or more. Their trunks so thick it would take 3 people holding hands to encircle them. The forest floor was carpeted with brown needles that muffled our footsteps. We had been walking for about 15 minutes when I noticed the deer stand. It was positioned about 20 feet up in a sturdy oak tree, constructed from weather-beaten plywood and 2x4s. What caught my attention immediately was the camouflage netting that had been carefully draped around the entire structure, making it nearly invisible from ground level. I only spotted it because a beam of sunlight happened to reflect off one of the nails. My brother wanted to keep moving, but my curiosity was overwhelming. Deer stands weren't uncommon in these woods, but something about this one felt different. It was too well hidden, too carefully concealed. Most hunters wanted their stands to be somewhat visible so they could find them again easily. This one seemed designed to avoid detection. "I'm going to climb up and take a look," I announced. The climb was more difficult than I'd anticipated. The wooden ladder rungs were slick with moss and morning dew, and several of them creaked ominously under my weight. When I finally pulled myself onto the platform, my heart was hammering from both exertion and a growing sense of unease. The stand was empty, which provided some relief. But as I settled onto the plywood platform and looked out through the camouflage netting, my breath caught in my throat. There, roughly 300 yards away through a gap in the trees, I could see a structure. At first, I thought it might be another hunting cabin. Dan had mentioned there were a few scattered throughout his property. But as I raised my binoculars and focused on it, I realized this was something else entirely. "There's a house out there," I called down to my brother. "I want to get closer." "Are you crazy?" he shouted back. "We don't know who lives there." He had a point, but the structure looked abandoned from this distance, and I couldn't shake my curiosity. After some argument, my brother reluctantly agreed to continue, though I could tell he was becoming increasingly nervous. We left the path and bushwhacked in the direction of the structure. The going was rough. We had to navigate around a ravine choked with kudzu vines and push through stands of mountain laurel that seemed determined to block our way. About 100 yards from the deer stand, we encountered something that made us both stop dead in our tracks. It was a jeep, or rather what remained of one. The vehicle sat off to the side of what appeared to be an even narrower path, one we hadn't noticed before. The jeep was ancient, its paint job faded to a mottled gray-green by years of exposure to the elements. All 4 tires were completely flat, and rust had eaten through the wheel wells and lower doors. Vines had begun growing through the engine compartment, and when I peered through the shattered driver's side window, I saw that the interior had been completely overtaken by mold. What struck me most was the location. We were miles from any road wide enough to accommodate a vehicle. How had this jeep gotten all the way out here? Had there once been a road that had long since been reclaimed by the forest? Or had someone deliberately driven it to this remote location for reasons I couldn't fathom? Beyond the jeep, the ground sloped sharply upward. A steep embankment that required us to use our hands as much as our feet to climb. At the top of this rise, breathing hard, we got our first clear view of the structure I'd seen from the deer stand. Calling it a house was generous. It was barely more than a shack, a ramshackle construction that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. The exterior walls were a patchwork of mismatched materials: weathered plywood, corrugated tin, even what appeared to be pieces of old highway signs nailed haphazardly in place. Every single window had been covered, not with curtains or blinds, but with newspaper pages that had yellowed with age and weather. Someone had used thick strips of duct tape to secure them, creating an airtight seal that made the structure look almost bunker-like. The roof was in terrible condition. A blue tarp had been stretched across roughly half of it, held in place by rocks and pieces of wood. The other half showed obvious holes where shingles had fallen away. The screen door hung crooked on its hinges, and more duct tape crisscrossed its surface. To the right of the shack sat an old swing set, the kind you might find in a backyard playground, but this one had been abandoned long ago. The swings were gone, leaving only rusted chains hanging from the crossbar. The metal frame had oxidized to a deep orange-brown, and the legs had sunk unevenly into the ground, causing the whole structure to lean at a precarious angle. Something about that swing set disturbed me deeply. The thought of children once playing in this desolate place. Then the smell hit us. It wasn't the stench of death or decay. I'd encountered dead animals in the woods before and knew what that smelled like. This was different, chemical in nature, sharp and acrid. It burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. I couldn't identify it, had never smelled anything quite like it before, but it triggered an instinctive alarm in my brain. This was the smell of something dangerous, something wrong. My brother grabbed my arm. "We need to leave," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Right now." I knew he was right, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring at that newspaper-covered shack, trying to understand what I was seeing. Instead of listening to my brother's pleas, I began to circle the structure, staying low and moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. I told myself I just wanted to see what was behind the building, that I'd only take a quick look and then we'd leave. But truthfully, something had taken hold of me, a morbid fascination that overrode my common sense. The rear of the property revealed even more disturbing details. A small camper trailer sat about 30 yards behind the main shack, and unlike the abandoned appearance of the house, this camper showed clear signs of current habitation. A battered pickup truck was parked beside it, the kind of old Ford that had probably been driven into the ground decades ago but somehow kept running through sheer stubbornness and duct tape. But what really caught my attention was the equipment scattered around the area. Dozens of large blue barrels, the kind that hold 50 gallons or more, were arranged in rough rows. Plastic tubes and hoses snaked between them, creating a complex network I couldn't begin to understand. There were several backpacks lying in the dirt, along with multiple coolers, some open and some sealed shut. Empty containers of what looked like drain cleaner and paint thinner were piled near the tree line. A thin plume of white smoke rose from somewhere near the camper, and I realized the chemical smell was emanating from that direction. It was much stronger here, so intense I could taste it in the back of my throat, bitter and metallic. That's when everything clicked into place. The isolated location, the concealed deer stand providing a view of anyone approaching, the barrels and hoses and chemical smell, the newspapers covering the windows. I'd seen enough public service announcements at school, and warnings from local law enforcement to recognize what I was looking at. These people were cooking methamphetamine. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. We weren't just trespassing on someone's property. We had stumbled onto an active drug laboratory. The kind of place where people carried guns and didn't ask questions before shooting. The kind of place where two kids could disappear and never be found. I turned to my brother, forcing my voice to remain calm even though terror was clawing at my chest. "We need to leave right now. Walk backwards slowly until we're behind that tree line, then we run. Understand?" His face had gone pale, and I could see he understood the danger even if he didn't fully grasp what we'd discovered. He nodded, his eyes wide. We had just started to back away when a voice shattered the silence. Hey you." The shout came from the direction of the camper, and I spun around to see a figure standing in the doorway. Even from this distance, we were maybe 75 yards away. I could tell he was looking directly at us. He was pointing, his arm extended like an accusation. My first thought was that we were far enough away and hidden enough by the undergrowth that he couldn't possibly see us clearly. But then I remembered the bright orange hat on my head, practically glowing against the muted browns and greens of the forest. I might as well have been waving a flag. I yanked the hat off my head and stuffed it into my jacket pocket with shaking hands. When I looked up again, a second man had emerged from the camper. Both of them were shouting now, their words indistinct, but the anger in their voices unmistakable. Then I saw what made my stomach drop. Both men were holding firearms. "Run," I said to my brother. Then louder, "Run." We bolted. Behind us I heard more shouting, and then a new sound that made my blood freeze. The deep, aggressive barking of a large dog. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw them releasing the animal from a chain. It was massive, dark-colored, possibly a Rottweiler or Pit Bull mix. The dog lunged forward the moment it was free, pulling the men along as they gave chase. The men were screaming threats now, their voices echoing through the forest. I couldn't make out most of the words, but the ones I did catch made it clear what would happen if they caught us. My brother was running beside me, his face twisted in absolute terror, tears streaming down his cheeks. The terrain that had seemed merely challenging on our way in now felt like an impossible obstacle course. We crashed through underbrush, leaped over fallen logs, and scrambled down slopes that threatened to send us tumbling. Behind us, the dogs' barking grew louder, closer. The men were shouting directions to each other, coordinating their pursuit. My mind was racing, trying to calculate distances and angles. They were gaining on us, there was no question about that. The dog was faster than we could ever be, and the men knew these woods. We were running blindly, while they were hunting us with purpose and experience. That's when I knew we couldn't outrun them. We had to hide. Up ahead, I spotted a massive fallen oak tree lying perpendicular to our path. It must have come down in a storm years ago, because it was enormous, at least 4 feet in diameter at the base. The root ball had torn out of the ground when it fell, creating a crater on one side. There. I grabbed my brother's arm and pulled him toward the tree. "Get on the other side and press yourself against it, as tight as you can." He didn't argue, just scrambled around to the far side of the massive trunk and pressed himself into the depression where the tree met the ground. I could hear the dog getting closer. We had maybe 30 seconds at most. I ran in the opposite direction, toward a small creek I could hear babbling somewhere ahead. My lungs were burning, my legs screaming in protest, but I pushed harder. When I reached the creek, it was barely 6 feet across. I yanked the orange hat from my pocket and threw it as far as I could to the opposite bank. Then I turned and sprinted back to the fallen tree. I tucked myself in front of my brother, trying to shield him with my body, and began frantically piling leaves and small branches over us. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip anything. I could hear the dog now, close enough that its barking seemed to vibrate through my chest. The men's footsteps crunched through the undergrowth. We pressed ourselves against that tree and stopped breathing. The dog reached us first. I could hear it panting, could smell its breath. It ran right past us, not even 3 feet from where we lay hidden. The men followed seconds later, and I got my first clear look at them through the gaps in our camouflage of leaves. The one holding the dog's chain was tall and heavy-set, with long, unkempt hair that fell past his shoulders. His beard was massive, a wild tangle of gray and black that covered most of his face. He wore filthy overalls and boots that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months. The other man was shorter but more wiry, and he was the one carrying the rifle. They stopped less than 30 yards from our hiding spot, right at the edge of the creek. The dog had found my hat and was sniffing it intensely, whining and pulling at its chain. The shorter man picked up the hat, turning it over in his hands. "They can't be far," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. We were right on top of them. The bearded man grunted, scanning the forest. For one terrible moment, his gaze seemed to linger on the fallen tree where we hid. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. My brother's hand found mine and I squeezed back, trying to send him some kind of reassurance I didn't feel. "Come on," the shorter man finally said. "They crossed the creek. Can't have gotten far." They started moving again, heading in the opposite direction from where we needed to go. The dog went with them reluctantly, still fixated on my hat. We waited, listening to the sound of their voices and the dog's barking fade into the distance. I counted to 300 in my head, forcing myself to wait even though every instinct screamed at me to run. When I finally couldn't stand it anymore, I carefully pushed aside the leaves covering us and looked around. The forest was empty, silent except for the normal sounds of birds and wind. "Come on," I whispered to my brother. Slowly, quietly, we extracted ourselves from our hiding spot and began moving back toward Dan's house. For the first 100 yards, we walked carefully, placing each foot deliberately to avoid making noise. But once we'd put some distance between ourselves and the creek, we ran. We ran harder and longer than I thought possible. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, and my legs had long since passed the point of pain into a kind of numb mechanical movement. But we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. Not until we saw the tin roof of Dan's cabin through the trees. When we finally stumbled out of the woods into Dan's clearing, he was working in his barn, organizing tools on a pegboard. He turned when he heard us crashing through the undergrowth, and his weathered face immediately registered alarm. We must have looked like we'd seen the devil himself. Mud-streaked, bleeding from numerous scratches, gasping for air, our eyes wild with residual terror. "You boys all right?" he asked, setting down his hammer and walking toward us. I wanted to tell him everything, to warn him about what was happening deep in his woods, but fear sealed my throat.
What if the men somehow found out we'd told? What if they came looking for us? What if telling got us or our family hurt?
"We're fine," I managed to gasp out. Just got turned around, lost track of time. Dan studied us for a long moment, and I could tell he didn't believe me. But he didn't press the issue. Instead, he offered to drive us back up to our house, and we accepted gratefully, too exhausted and shaken to make the walk. The ride back took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. My brother sat beside me in the back of Dan's truck, still trembling, still silent. When we pulled up to our house, we thanked Dan and hurried inside. We never told our parents what happened. Not that day, not for years afterward. We were terrified that if we admitted to what we'd seen, we'd get in trouble for going so far into the woods. We feared they'd never let us outside again, and more than anything, we were afraid of those men, afraid they might somehow find us, might come to our house in the middle of the night. It was only several years later, after I'd graduated high school and my brother was in college, that I finally told my father the truth. By that point, Dan had sold his property to developers. The entire forest had been logged, every tree cut down and hauled away. Where that shack and camper had once hidden in the dense woods, construction crews were now building expensive homes with 3-car garages and manicured lawns. My father listened to the story with a grave expression, then tried to reassure me that we'd probably just encountered hunters. But I knew better. I knew what we'd seen, what we'd stumbled into that day in the woods. We'd come face to face with something dark and dangerous, and only luck and quick thinking had saved us. Sometimes I drive past that development, with its uniform houses and neat sidewalks, and I think about what lies buried beneath all that suburban normalcy. The memories, the fear, the secrets that the forest once kept. And I wonder if the new homeowners ever smell something strange on certain days, ever feel an inexplicable unease when they walk through their backyards. These days I still love hiking and hunting. The outdoors is still a part of who I am, but I'm more careful now. I understand that the woods can hold beauty and danger in equal measure, that not every path should be followed, and that sometimes the smart thing to do is turn back before you see what's waiting around the bend. I thank God we made it out of those woods that day, because I know deep in my bones that we very easily might not have. The events I'm about to recount occurred in the summer of 2021, when I was 16 years old and thought I understood the boundaries between safety and danger. How wrong I was. The events I'm about to recount occurred in the summer of 2021, when I was 16 years old and thought I understood the boundaries between safety and danger. How wrong I was. That particular evening in late August carried the oppressive weight that only the final days of summer can bring. The air hung thick and stagnant, refusing to cool even as the sun disappeared behind the tree line. I had been struggling with problems that seemed insurmountable at 16. The kind of troubles that feel like they'll define your entire existence when you're that young. My parents had been fighting constantly, their voices echoing through our house like gunshots in the night. School was starting again in 2 weeks, and I dreaded returning to face the same bullies who had made my life miserable the previous year. The only thing that brought me any semblance of peace was my motorcycle, a modest 125cc Honda that I had saved up for by working weekends at the local hardware store. It wasn't much to look at, with its faded red paint and a few scratches on the tank. But when I fired up that engine and felt the vibration of the V-twin beneath me, the world's problems seemed to fade into the background noise of everyday life. That night, around 10:30 p.m., I made the decision that would haunt me for years to come. I needed to clear my head, to feel the wind cutting through the humid air, and hear nothing but the steady rhythm of the engine. I pulled on my gear, a black leather jacket that had seen better days, my helmet with a small crack near the visor that I kept meaning to replace, heavy boots, and gloves that had protected my hands through countless rides. The garage door groaned as it opened, revealing the empty street bathed in the orange glow of sodium streetlights. Most of the houses in our neighborhood were dark, their occupants already lost in dreams or trying to escape the heat in air-conditioned bedrooms. I wheeled the bike out carefully, not wanting to wake anyone with the sound of the engine starting. When I pressed the ignition button, the motorcycle came to life with a satisfying rumble that seemed to resonate in my chest. I let it warm up for a moment, checking my mirrors and making sure everything was secure. The familiar ritual of preparing for a ride always calmed my nerves, like a meditation that required my full attention. As I pulled out of the driveway and onto the main road through town, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car heading home from a late dinner or the night shift at the factory on the outskirts of town. The businesses were all closed, their neon signs either dark or flickering with that persistent hum that seems to follow you even when you can no longer see the source. I rode through the center of town, past the old courthouse with its clock tower that hadn't kept accurate time in decades, past the diner where I sometimes stopped for coffee before school, past the park where children played during the day but which now stood empty and somehow ominous in the darkness. Everything looked different at night, familiar places transformed into something foreign and slightly threatening. The speed limit through town was only 35 kilometers per hour, but I kept it even slower, savoring the ride and trying to stretch out this moment of peace for as long as possible. I knew that once I returned home I would have to face the reality of my problems again. For now, though, I was suspended in this bubble of motion and engine noise, temporarily free from everything that had been weighing on my mind. As I reached the edge of town, I had to make a decision about which direction to take. There were several routes I could follow: the main highway that led to the next town over, the winding back roads that curved through farmland, or the dead-end road that led out to the lakes where people sometimes went fishing during the day. The dead-end road called to me that night. It was the quietest option, rarely traveled even during daylight hours, and it would give me the solitude I was craving. The road stretched for about 4 kilometers through increasingly dense forest before ending at a small parking area near the water. It would be the perfect place to turn around and head home, hopefully with a clearer mind than when I had started. I turned onto the narrow asphalt road, immediately noticing how the darkness seemed to swallow my headlight beam after just a few meters. The trees on either side grew thicker and taller as I progressed, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out most of the stars. What little moonlight had been visible in town was now completely obscured, leaving only my single headlight to cut through the oppressive blackness. The road had no streetlights, no houses, no signs of human habitation whatsoever. During the day, it was a pleasant drive with glimpses of wildlife and the occasional hiker, but at night it felt like traveling through a tunnel into some other realm entirely. The temperature dropped noticeably as I moved deeper into the forest, and I could smell the rich earthy scent of decomposing leaves and damp soil. My speedometer showed I was traveling at about 45 kilometers per hour, fast enough to feel like I was making progress, but slow enough to react if I encountered any deer or other animals that might wander onto the road. The engine noise seemed amplified in the enclosed space of the forest, echoing off the trees and coming back to me in strange, distorted ways. About a kilometer into the forest, I began to feel an odd sensation that I couldn't quite identify at first. It was as if someone was watching me, though I knew that was impossible given the remote location. I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, though they showed nothing but darkness behind me. The feeling grew stronger as I continued, settling into my stomach like a cold stone. I tried to dismiss the sensation as simple nervousness brought on by the isolation and darkness, but it persisted and even seemed to intensify. My grip on the handlebars tightened involuntarily, and I realized I was holding my breath for long periods without noticing. The peaceful feeling I had been seeking was rapidly being replaced by an anxiety that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The trees seemed to press closer to the road. The deeper I went, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to snag my jacket or helmet. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, probably just the play of my headlight across the uneven bark and leaves, but they looked disturbingly like figures darting between the trunks just out of sight. I considered turning around several times, but each time I pushed forward, telling myself I was being ridiculous. This was a road I had traveled dozens of times during daylight hours. There was nothing dangerous here except my own imagination running wild in the darkness. I was almost halfway to the lakes now anyway. It made more sense to continue to the end and turn around there than to attempt a three-point turn on the narrow road. The engine continued its steady rhythm, but even that familiar sound began to seem ominous in the consuming darkness. Every small noise, the creak of my leather jacket, the whistle of wind past my helmet, the soft rustle of leaves overhead, seemed amplified and threatening. I found myself straining to hear something else, some sound that would explain the growing dread that was settling over me like a suffocating blanket. That's when I first saw the pale shape moving in the distance ahead. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, perhaps my headlight reflecting off a deer or some piece of trash that had blown onto the road. But as I drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something that made my mouth go dry with sudden terror. It was a person, walking slowly down the center of the road with their back to me. They were dressed entirely in white, not the crisp white of clean clothing, but a dull grayish white that seemed to absorb the light from my headlight rather than reflect it. The figure moved with an odd shuffling gait that didn't seem quite natural, as if they were having difficulty coordinating their movements. I immediately slowed the motorcycle, my training and common sense telling me to be cautious around pedestrians, especially in such an isolated location. But even as I reduced my speed, questions began flooding my mind. What was someone doing out here at nearly 11 p.m., walking alone on a road that led nowhere? There were no houses along this stretch, no businesses, no reason for anyone to be here on foot at this hour. The figure wore no reflective clothing, carried no flashlight or any other source of illumination. In fact, as I got closer, I realized they weren't even walking on the shoulder of the road but directly down the center line, as if they owned the space or simply didn't care about the possibility of oncoming traffic. I slowed to about 20 kilometers per hour and moved as far to the left as I dared without risking sliding into the drainage ditch that ran alongside the road. My plan was simple: pass by carefully, maybe call out to ask if they needed help, and continue on to the lakes. It was the decent thing to do, even though every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn around immediately. As I drew nearer, more disturbing details became apparent. The person's hair was long and unkempt, hanging down their back in tangled strands that seemed to move independently of any breeze. Their clothing, which I could now see was some kind of loose gown or dress, was torn and stained with dark patches that could have been mud or something far worse. But it was their posture that truly unnerved me. Their head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if their neck was broken, or they were trying to look at something that existed in a dimension I couldn't perceive. Their arms hung at their sides, but their hands were moving constantly, fingers writhing and grasping at the air as if trying to catch invisible insects. I was about 20 meters away when I made the fatal mistake of downshifting to first gear, thinking I might need to stop if the person was injured or in distress. The change in engine notes seemed to catch their attention, because their heads snapped up with a movement so sudden and violent that I nearly lost control of the motorcycle. Even through my helmet and face shield, I could see their face clearly in the stark white glow of my headlight. It was a sight that would be burned into my memory forever. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes that reflected the light like those of a nocturnal animal, and a mouth that was open far wider than should have been humanly possible. But it was when that mouth began to work, when sounds started emerging from it, that I realized I was in the presence of something that defied all rational explanation while still being terrifyingly, impossibly real. The sound that erupted from the figure's throat was unlike anything I had ever heard before or have heard since. It wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a howl, but something that seemed to combine the worst elements of both. It was a sound of pure rage and hunger, of pain that had been fermenting for years, of madness given voice. The volume was impossible, louder than my motorcycle engine, louder than anything a human throat should have been capable of producing. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the trees and the asphalt and the very air around me. I felt it in my bones, in my teeth, in the deepest part of my brain where fear lives. And then the figure began to move toward me. What happened next? unfolded in a series of moments that seemed both to last forever and to pass in the blink of an eye. The figure in white didn't just turn toward me. They launched themselves in my direction with a speed and ferocity that violated every law of human movement I thought I understood. I had been traveling at about 15 kilometers per hour when that inhuman sound ripped through the night air. My immediate reaction was to twist the throttle, but in my panic I nearly stalled the engine by giving it too much gas too quickly. The motorcycle lurched forward, then bogged down as the engine struggled to respond to my desperate commands. The figure was closing the distance between us with long, loping strides that covered far more ground than should have been possible. As they ran, their arms windmilled wildly, and that terrible sound continued to pour from their throat in waves that seemed to physically assault me. I could feel the sound penetrating my helmet, vibrating through my skull, making my vision blur with its intensity. I managed to get the motorcycle moving again, but the small engine was no match for the adrenaline-fueled pursuit that was unfolding. A 125cc motor is designed for fuel efficiency, not rapid acceleration, and the modifications I had made to improve gas mileage had only made the situation worse. As I struggled to build speed, I could hear footsteps pounding on the asphalt behind me, getting closer with each passing second. The tachometer needle swept upward as I kept the throttle pinned wide open, climbing through 6,000, 7,000 RPM. I should have shifted into second gear, but I was terrified that the brief moment of reduced power during the shift would give my pursuer the chance they needed to reach me. The engine was screaming now, operating well beyond its designed limits, but I didn't dare let up on the gas. At 9,000 RPM, I finally forced myself to grab the clutch and jam the gear lever up into second. For a heart-stopping moment, the engine's note dropped as I made the transition, and I swear I could feel the presence behind me drawing closer. But then the clutch engaged, and the motorcycle surged forward with renewed power. It was then that I felt the impact. Something struck the rear of my motorcycle with tremendous force, not quite hard enough to knock me off, but sufficient to send a shockwave through the frame that I felt in every part of my body. I looked in my mirror and caught a glimpse of wild hair and pale clothing just behind my rear wheel, close enough that I could have reached back and touched them. The impact came again, this time accompanied by the sound of fingernails or claws scraping against the plastic of my taillight. I could hear heavy breathing that seemed to come from everywhere around me, and underneath that a low growling sound that raised every hair on my body. I was doing about 25 kilometers per hour now, which should have been fast enough to outrun any person on foot, but the figure was keeping pace with me. Through my mirrors I could see them matching my speed stride for stride, their movements becoming more frenzied and violent with each passing moment. They were reaching for me now, their arms extending toward my back with fingers that seemed far too long to be human. The engine was approaching 10,000 RPM again, well into the red zone, but I pushed it even higher. At 11,000 RPM, the motor began to make sounds I had never heard before, metallic rattling and grinding, that suggested I was doing permanent damage. At 12,000 RPM, I was certain the engine was going to explode, but still I didn't let up. It wasn't until the tachometer needle touched 13,000 RPM that I finally began to pull away from my pursuer. The speedometer showed 27 kilometers per hour when I first noticed the footsteps beginning to fade. By the time I hit 30 kilometers per hour, the terrible sounds were finally starting to diminish, though whether that was due to distance or because the figure had given up the chase, I couldn't tell. I didn't slow down to find out. I kept the throttle wide open until I reached the end of the road, where the asphalt gave way to a small parking area near the edge of the lake. Only then did I risk a look behind me, and I saw nothing but empty roads stretching back into the darkness. But I could still hear that inhuman sound echoing through the forest, fainter now but no less terrifying, as if it was being carried on the wind from somewhere deep in the trees. Standing at the edge of the lake, with my engine ticking as it cooled and my heart hammering against my ribs, I realized the true horror of my situation. I was trapped at the end of a dead-end road with something unnatural lurking in the darkness behind me. The only way back to town was the same route I had just traveled, which meant facing whatever that thing was a second time. The parking area was small, and surrounded on three sides by dense forest. The lake stretched out in front of me, its surface black as oil under the starless sky. There was no sound except for the gentle lapping of water against the shore, and the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. But underneath that peaceful facade, I could sense something watching me from the tree line. I sat on my motorcycle for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. trying to decide what to do. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the handlebars, and I was sweating profusely despite the cool night air. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might be hiding that pale figure, waiting for me to let my guard down. I considered calling for help, but my phone showed no signal bars. The forest was too dense and remote for cell coverage. I thought about waiting until dawn, but that was still 7 hours away, and I wasn't sure I could maintain my sanity sitting alone in the darkness for that long. The longer I waited, the more likely it became that the thing would find another way to reach me. That's when I remembered the hiking trail. About 50 meters to my left, barely visible in the glow of my headlight, was the entrance to a narrow gravel path that wound through the forest for several kilometers before emerging near a residential area on the other side of town. I had hiked it once before during daylight hours and remembered that it was just wide enough for a motorcycle if you were careful about the trees and rocks. The plan that formed in my mind was desperate and dangerous, but it was the only option I could think of that didn't involve traveling back down the road where that thing was waiting. I would turn off my headlight to avoid being seen, navigate the trail by feel in whatever minimal moonlight might filter through the canopy, and hope I could make it to the other end without crashing into a tree or sliding off the path into the undergrowth. I reached down and found the headlight switch, an old-fashioned toggle that newer motorcycles didn't have. Most modern bikes kept their lights on whenever the engine was running, but this older model gave me the option to ride in complete darkness. It was a feature I had never used before and hoped I would never need to use again. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm my nerves, I flipped the switch and was immediately plunged into absolute blackness. The darkness was so complete that I couldn't see my own hands on the handlebars, couldn't see the ground beneath my wheels, couldn't see anything beyond the end of my nose. It was like being blind, but worse, because I knew there were obstacles everywhere that could kill me if I made a single mistake. I let the clutch out slowly and began to move forward at barely above idle speed, using the sound of the gravel under my tires to guide me. The path was rougher than I remembered, with potholes and loose stones that made the motorcycle buck and slide unpredictably. Several times I nearly lost control as the front wheel hit an unseen obstacle or the rear tire spun in a patch of sand. But worse than the physical challenges of navigating in darkness was the psychological torture of not knowing what might be lurking just outside my narrow cone of awareness. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, made me flinch and nearly lose control. I kept expecting to hear that terrible scream again, to feel hands grabbing at me from the shadows, to suddenly find myself face to face with those reflecting eyes. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. What had taken perhaps half an hour to hike during the day felt like it was taking hours in the darkness. My neck and shoulders ached from the constant tension of straining to see through the blackness, and my hands were cramping from gripping the handlebars so tightly. Then, just when I was beginning to think I had somehow gotten lost and was traveling in circles, I saw a faint glow ahead through the trees. It was the orange light of a street lamp, marking the edge of the residential area where the trail emerged. I had never been so happy to see artificial light in my entire life. When I finally reached the end of the trail and felt smooth asphalt under my tires again, I immediately turned my headlight back on and twisted the throttle to put as much distance as possible between myself and the forest. The residential street was well lit and lined with houses whose windows glowed warmly with the light of television screens and table lamps. Normal people were living normal lives behind those walls, completely unaware of the nightmare I had just escaped. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road that led back to my neighborhood. Even then, I found myself constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the shadows between streetlights for any sign of pursuit. My motorcycle had performed admirably during the escape, but I could tell from the sound of the engine that I had done serious damage by over-revving it so severely. It was running rough now, with occasional misfires that made the bike jerk and stutter. The ride home, which normally took about 15 minutes, seemed to last forever. Every intersection where I had to slow down or stop felt like an opportunity for something to catch up with me. Every dark alley or patch of shadow looked like it might be hiding that pale figure. I ran 2 red lights rather than sit still in the open, and I'm sure I exceeded the speed limit by a significant margin, but I didn't care about traffic violations at that moment. When I finally turned onto my street, I felt a wave of relief so powerful that it almost made me dizzy. The familiar sight of my house, with its porch light glowing and my parents' car in the driveway, represented safety and normalcy in a way I had never appreciated before. But even as I approached my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I pulled up to the garage door and fumbled for the remote control with hands that were still trembling. The door seemed to take forever to open, and I kept looking over my shoulder while I waited. When the opening was finally large enough, I rode the motorcycle inside and immediately hit the button to close the door behind me. Even inside the garage, with the door sealed shut, I didn't feel completely safe. I sat on the bike for several minutes, listening to the engine tick as it cooled and straining to hear any sound that might indicate I had been followed. The garage felt like a fortress, but I knew that feeling was probably just an illusion. When I finally dismounted and began to remove my gear, I noticed that my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the zipper on my jacket. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and I could smell the fierce scent that my body had been producing for the past hour. It was an acrid, sharp odor that reminded me of the smell that hospitals sometimes have. The smell of people in distress. I checked the motorcycle over for damage and found several long scratches on the rear fender that definitely hadn't been there when I started the ride. They looked like they might have been made by fingernails, though I tried to convince myself they were probably just from branches along the hiking trail. The engine was still making odd noises as it cooled, and I suspected I would need expensive repairs, but at that moment I didn't care about the cost. The walk from the garage to the back door of the house, a distance of maybe 10 meters, felt like crossing an open battlefield. I moved as quickly as possible while still trying to look casual in case any neighbors were watching from their windows. The last thing I wanted was to have to explain why I was acting like a lunatic at midnight. Once inside the house, I locked the door and engaged the deadbolt, then checked to make sure all the other doors and windows were secure. The familiar sounds of home, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the kitchen wall, the distant murmur of the television in my parents' bedroom, were incredibly comforting after the alien sounds of the forest. But even surrounded by the safety of my own home, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had experienced. The rational part of my mind kept trying to find logical explanations. Maybe it had been someone having a mental health crisis. Maybe it had been a prank. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing due to stress and darkness. But I knew what I had seen and heard, and no amount of rationalization could explain away the impossible speed of that pursuit or the inhuman quality of that scream. I barely managed 2 hours of fitful rest before giving up entirely and getting out of bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale figure running behind me with their arms outstretched and their mouth open in that terrible scream. When I did manage to doze off, I was immediately jolted awake by nightmares so vivid and terrifying that I was afraid to return to whatever realm my unconscious mind was visiting. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I needed to go back to that road, in daylight, with someone else along for support and verification. If I had truly encountered something supernatural or unexplainable, there might be evidence. If it had been some kind of elaborate prank or misunderstanding, I needed to know for my own sanity. I called my best friend Tyler around 8 a.m. Tyler was someone I had known since elementary school, someone who had always been level-headed and practical. If anyone could help me make sense of what had happened, it would be him. "I need you to come with me somewhere today," I told him when he answered the phone. "Something happened last night and I need to show you where it occurred." Tyler could hear the tension in my voice and agreed to meet me at my house within an hour. When he arrived, I gave him a carefully edited version of the story, focusing on the basic facts while downplaying some of the more unbelievable details. Even so, he listened with growing concern and agreed that we should investigate the area in daylight. We took Tyler's car rather than my motorcycle, which was still making concerning noises and would need professional attention before I felt comfortable riding it again. The drive to the dead-end road took about 20 minutes, and during that time I found myself becoming increasingly nervous about what we might find. In daylight, the road looked completely different. What had seemed like a tunnel through dark, threatening forest was revealed to be a pleasant drive through mature woodlands. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, birds sang in the trees, and everything looked peaceful and normal. It was hard to believe that the same location had been the scene of such terror just hours before. We drove slowly down the road, with me pointing out landmarks and trying to identify the exact spot where I had first seen the figure. When we reached what I thought was the right area, Tyler pulled over and we got out to examine the pavement and the surrounding forest. The search was both thorough and disappointing. We spent over an hour combing through the area, looking for any sign that someone had been there recently. We searched for footprints, for clothing fibers caught on branches, for anything that might confirm my story or provide clues about who or what I had encountered. We found nothing. The asphalt showed no unusual marks or stains. The forest floor on either side of the road was covered with undisturbed leaves and undergrowth. There were no paths leading into the woods, no signs of recent passage, no evidence that anyone had been in the area for days or even weeks. Tyler was diplomatic about our lack of findings, but I could see the doubt growing in his eyes. He wanted to believe me, but the complete absence of physical evidence was hard to ignore. We walked the entire 2-kilometer stretch of road, checking both sides carefully, but found only tire tracks from normal traffic and the occasional piece of litter that had been there for months. The most disturbing discovery was how normal everything appeared. In daylight, surrounded by the sounds of birds and insects, it was almost impossible to imagine anything sinister happening here. The forest looked benign, even welcoming, and the road seemed like exactly what it was, a quiet route used by hikers and fishermen to access the lakes. As we stood at the end of the road near the parking area, Tyler finally voiced what we were both thinking. "Are you sure it wasn't just someone out for a late-night walk who maybe startled you?" he asked gently. "Maybe they shouted because they were surprised by your motorcycle, and in the darkness and confusion everything seemed more threatening than it actually was." I wanted to accept his rational explanation. It would have been so much easier to believe that I had simply overreacted to an innocent encounter, that fear and darkness had transformed a normal person into the monster I remembered. But I knew what I had experienced, and no amount of wishful thinking could change those memories. The scratches on my motorcycle were real. The damage to my engine from over-revving was real. The terror I had felt was real. And somewhere deep in my gut I knew that what I had encountered on that road was not entirely human, even if I couldn't prove it and couldn't explain it. 3 years have passed since that night, and I still have no satisfactory explanation for what happened on the dead-end road. I've researched local history, looking for reports of similar encounters or unusual incidents in the area. I've spoken to park rangers, police officers, and longtime residents of the town. Nobody has ever heard of anything like what I experienced. The rational part of my mind has developed several theories over time. Perhaps it was someone suffering from a severe mental health crisis who had wandered away from a treatment facility. Perhaps it was a person under the influence of drugs who had become disoriented and aggressive. Perhaps it was even some kind of elaborate prank designed to scare motorcyclists, though the logistics of such a prank would have been incredibly complex. But none of these explanations account for all the details I remember. The impossible speed of pursuit, the inhuman quality of that scream, the way the figure seemed to move with a coordination that was simultaneously too fluid and too jerky to be natural. These memories remain as vivid and disturbing as they were on the night they were formed. I've never returned to that road, and I don't intend to. Whether what I encountered was human, animal, or something else entirely, it represented a level of danger and unpredictability that I have no desire to face again. The forest may be beautiful in daylight, but I know what can lurk in its shadows after dark. The experience changed me in ways that I'm still discovering. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings, more respectful of the fact that there are things in this world that I don't understand and may never understand. I've also become more empathetic to others who claim to have had unusual or unexplainable experiences, because I know how isolating it can be to carry memories that others find hard to believe. My motorcycle was eventually repaired, though it never ran quite the same after that night. I sold it 6 months later and bought a car instead. I told myself it was for practical reasons. Better weather protection, more storage space, improved safety. But the truth is that I had lost the sense of freedom and peace that riding had once provided. Every time I got on the bike, I found myself thinking about what might be waiting around the next curve or behind the next tree. Tyler remains a good friend, and he's never directly challenged my account of what happened. But I can tell he thinks I experienced some kind of panic attack or hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. That's fine with me. I don't need anyone else to believe my story or validate my memories. I know what I experienced, and that knowledge is both a burden and a gift. The burden is obvious. The lingering fear, the disrupted sense of safety, the knowledge that reality can be far stranger and more threatening than most people imagine. But there's also a gift in that experience. A reminder that the world is vast and mysterious, and full of things that science hasn't yet cataloged or explained. Sometimes, late at night when I'm having trouble falling asleep, I think about that figure in white. I wonder who or what they were, where they came from, and whether they're still out there in the forest. I wonder if other people have encountered them, and if so, whether those people were lucky enough to escape as I did. I've learned to live with these questions, to accept that some mysteries may never be solved. But I've also learned to trust my instincts more completely, to take my own perceptions seriously, even when they conflict with conventional wisdom or social expectations. That night on the dead-end road taught me that the boundary between the known and unknown is far thinner than most people believe. It taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite fear. And it taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply survive long enough to tell the story, even if nobody else fully believes it. As I write this account, I can hear the sound of motorcycles passing by on the street outside my window. The sound no longer fills me with longing for the open road, but it doesn't fill me with terror either. It simply reminds me of a younger version of myself who thought he understood the difference between safety and danger, between the natural and unnatural, between what was possible and what was not. I know better now. And perhaps that knowledge, uncomfortable as it sometimes is, will serve me well if I ever again find myself face to face with something that defies explanation. Because I'm certain of one thing. That night on the dead-end road was not the last time I'll encounter the mysterious and unexplainable in this strange and wonderful world. God help me. I just hope I'm better prepared for it next time. They say when you stare into the wilderness long enough, something out there starts staring back. After 24 years in search and rescue, I've felt those eyes more times than I care to admit. I'm Garrett Teague, a search and rescue officer with the United States Forest Service. Been at it since '97, and I've seen just about everything out here in these woods. Or so I thought. The night before it all happened, I had that dream again. The one where I'm walking through pitch-black forest, my flashlight beam swallowed by darkness that seems to breathe. Something follows behind me, always just out of sight. I can hear it breathing. Wet, ragged breaths that don't sound like anything that should exist in this world. I never turn around in the dream. I never see it. But I know if I did, I'd never wake up. I jerked awake at 5:37 a.m., sheets damp with sweat despite the cabin's chill. Outside my window, the pines surrounding my small Forest Service cabin stood like sentinels against the pre-dawn darkness. I lived alone on the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona by choice. 20-plus years of finding people at their worst moments had turned me into something of a hermit. My ex-wife had called it emotional hibernation when she left 8 years ago. Maybe she was right. My phone buzzed, vibrating against the wooden nightstand like an angry insect. Command center. They never called this early unless something was wrong. Teague, I answered, my voice still rough with sleep. Got a live one, said Marissa from dispatch. I could hear the coffee machine gurgling in the background at the ranger station. Overnight hiker, didn't check in. Car still at the Weatherford trailhead since yesterday morning. I sighed, rubbing my face with my free hand. Tourist? Seems like it. Some tech executive from California named Devin Matthews, reservation at the Little America Hotel, didn't show up last night. Hotel called it in. Solo? You got it. Signed the trail register solo. No emergency contact listed besides his workplace. Christ. These people, I muttered. What's he wearing? Any medical conditions? Navy blue North Face jacket. Khaki hiking pants. According to his rental car agency, he picked up all new gear at the outfitter in town before heading up. No listed medical conditions we know of. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, feeling the familiar ache in my right knee, souvenir from a rescue gone wrong in 2003. A banker from Phoenix had fallen into a ravine. I'd gotten him out, but my knee had never been the same. I'll grab Tom, I said. We'll head out within the hour. Roger that. Weather's holding for now, but we've got a system moving in tonight. Perfect. Nothing like racing against a storm to find some city slicker who thought the wilderness was just an Instagram backdrop. Tom Greer's pickup was already idling in my driveway when I stepped outside, thermal mug of black coffee in hand. He always drove. Ever since that night in 2008 when I'd almost wrapped my truck around a pine tree after a 48-hour search for a missing 6-year-old. We'd found her. Not everyone gets that lucky. Tom rolled down his window. his square jaw covered in the same salt and pepper stubble he'd had for the decade I'd known him. Ex-Marine, built like a concrete bunker, with hands that could break a man's neck but were gentle enough to splint a hiker's fractured arm without causing more pain. "Morning sunshine," he said, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Heard we've got another genius on our hands." I slid into the passenger seat. The familiar smell of Tom's truck, pine air freshener, gun oil, and the faint sweetness of the protein bars he always kept in the center console, oddly comforting. "Some Silicon Valley type," I confirmed, taking a sip of my coffee. Probably thought he'd commune with nature or whatever the hell they're into these days. Tom chuckled, a low rumble that matched the truck's engine as he backed out of my driveway. "Remember that guy last summer? The one who brought a drone but forgot extra water? Had to airlift his dehydrated ass off the mountain." I nodded. Cost the taxpayers 20 grand because he wanted aerial shots for his dating profile. The road to the station curved through dense pine forest, the morning light barely penetrating the canopy. As we drove, I briefed Tom on what little we knew about our missing hiker. Devin Matthews, mid-30s, tech executive, solo hike, no experience that we know of. I scrolled through the information Marissa had sent to my phone. Last seen at the Weatherford trailhead around 10 a.m. yesterday. San Francisco peaks in October. Tom shook his head. Temperature drops like a stone after sundown. If he wasn't prepared. Yeah, the unspoken hung between us. If Matthews hadn't found shelter, we might be recovering a body, not rescuing a hiker. We pulled into the station, a weathered wooden building that had seen better days. Inside, the command center was already humming with activity. Maps spread across tables, radio chatter filling the air, the smell of industrial coffee and dry erase markers. Captain Sandoval looked up as we entered. "Teague, Greer, glad you're here." She gestured to a topographical map of the San Francisco peaks. "We've got a search grid established. Matthew's car is here." She pointed to the Weatherford trailhead. "And based on the trail register, he was planning to do the loop around Humphreys Peak." "That's a hell of a hike for an amateur," Tom remarked, studying the map, "especially solo." "Exactly," Sandoval agreed. "With the elevation and his presumed inexperience, we're focusing our search here, about 5 miles in, where the trail gets tricky and people often lose their way." I leaned over the map, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest. Search and rescue isn't like they show it on TV. It's not dramatic helicopter rescues and tearful reunions. Most of the time it's grim, methodical work against the clock, against the elements, against human stupidity. "Any aerial support?" I asked. "Negative," Sandoval shook her head. "Cloud ceiling's too low. You'll be on foot." I nodded, already mentally cataloging the gear we'd need. Tom was doing the same, his eyes distant as he processed information with the efficiency that had kept us both alive in situations where others might have died. "His cell phone?" Tom asked. "Last ping was near the trailhead, then nothing. Either it died or he's in a dead zone." Sandoval handed us each a printout with Matthew's details. He did register at the trailhead, so at least he did one thing right. I studied the photocopied registration form. The handwriting was neat, precise. The kind of handwriting you'd expect from someone who thought they had control over everything in their life. Next to Devin's signature was a small doodle, something that looked like a spiral with lines radiating outward. Probably nothing, but something about it made my skin prickle. "What's this?" I pointed to the doodle. Sandoval glanced at it. "No idea. Maybe some company logo? Tech people are weird." I nodded, but couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. In 24 years, I developed something of a sixth sense about searches. Some felt routine from the start. Others carried a weight to them, a heaviness that settled in your gut and told you something wasn't right. This one felt heavy. We geared up in silence, checking equipment with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this hundreds of times. Radio, first aid kit, GPS, extra batteries, water, protein bars, emergency blankets, flashlights, flares, the tools of our trade. As I shouldered my pack, Tom caught my eye. "You good?" I nodded, but we both knew what the question really meant. "You feel it too?" "Let's find this idiot and go home," I said instead. Outside, the October sky hung low and gray, the air sharp with the promise of winter. As we loaded our gear into the department SUV, I glanced up at the San Francisco peaks looming in the distance. their upper reaches already swallowed by clouds. Something was waiting for us up there. I didn't know what, but as we pulled away from the station, the dream from that morning lingered at the edges of my mind. The darkness, the breathing, the certainty that something was following. Always just out of sight. Some primal part of me knew this wouldn't be a standard missing person case. Not even close. The drive to the trailhead was mostly silent. Tom and I had worked together long enough that we didn't need to fill the air with needless chatter. The radio crackled occasionally with updates from dispatch, but nothing new about our missing hiker. We passed through stands of ponderosa pine, their trunks rust-colored in the morning light. Aspen groves shimmered with golden leaves, a stark contrast to the darkening sky. In any other circumstance, it would have been beautiful. Today, the forest felt watchful, as if holding its breath. You remember that case in 2011? Tom asked suddenly, breaking the silence as we navigated a particularly rough stretch of forest road. Which one? I asked, though something in his tone told me exactly which case he meant. The Matthews kid. I felt a cold finger trace down my spine. Different Matthews, I said, more to myself than to Tom. Yeah. Tom's eyes stayed fixed on the road. Just weird coincidence. But we both knew there was no such thing as coincidence in these mountains. The case Tom referred to involved another Matthews. No relation, just the same last name. A 12-year-old boy who'd wandered away from a family camping trip. We'd found him 3 days later, alive but changed. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't make eye contact. When the medical team examined him, they found strange geometrical bruises on his back that couldn't be explained. The boy had eventually recovered, physically at least, but he never told anyone what happened during those 3 days. You ever think about him? Tom asked. The kid? Sometimes, I admitted. The truth was, I thought about him more than I cared to admit. Last I'd heard, he'd been institutionalized somewhere in California. The official report cited exposure and trauma as the cause of his condition. The unofficial conversations among the search team acknowledged that something about the case defied explanation. We arrived at the Weatherford trailhead just after 1:30 p.m. The parking lot was half empty. A few cars belonging to day hikers, who'd be heading back soon as the weather turned. Matthews Rental, a shiny black Jeep Wrangler that had probably never seen actual off-road use before this trip, sat alone at the far end of the lot. Tom pulled alongside it, and we both got out to take a look. Nothing unusual visible through the windows, a receipt from the outdoor store in town, a map of the national forest, an empty coffee cup from a place called Technologia in San Francisco, the expected debris of a tourist's journey. No signs of hurried departure or struggle, Tom noted, peering through the driver's side window. Locked up proper. I nodded, scanning the trailhead area. The sign-in station showed Matthews had logged in at 9:47 a.m. the previous day. No sign out, of course. Let's move, I said, shouldering my pack. We've got maybe 5 hours of daylight left. The trail started gently enough, winding through fragrant pine and fir. The air grew thinner as we ascended, the temperature dropping with each 100 feet of elevation gain. We called out periodically.
Devin Matthews, Forest Service!
Our voices echoing through the trees with no response but the occasional startled bird. 2 hours in, the trail narrowed and grew steeper. Loose volcanic scree made footing treacherous in spots. The weather was holding, but the clouds above had thickened, blotting out the sun and casting the forest in a grayish pall that made every shadow seem deeper than it should be. If he was inexperienced, this is where he might have had trouble, Tom said, pausing to catch his breath. Despite his fitness, the elevation was substantial enough to make even his ex-Marine lungs work harder. I nodded, scanning the area. The trail forked here, the main path continuing up toward Humphreys Peak, a smaller game trail veering off to the right. The game trail wasn't on the official maps given to tourists, but locals knew it led to a series of small meadows popular with wildlife photographers. Which way would you go if you were a tech exec playing Mountain Man? I asked. Tom studied both paths. Main trail seems obvious, but he knelt down, examining the ground. Looks like someone went this way not too long ago. He pointed to a partial boot print in a patch of mud on the game trail. The tread pattern matched the high-end hiking boots we knew Matthews had purchased in town. Let's check it out, I said, unclipping my radio. Dispatch, this is Teague. We're approximately 4.5 miles up the Weatherford Trail. pursuing a possible track on an unmarked game path heading northeast from the main junction. Over. Copy that, Teague. Marissa's voice crackled back. Be advised, weather systems accelerated. Expect precipitation within 2 hours. Over. Understood. We'll keep you posted. Out. Tom gave me a look. 2 hours? Yeah. I glanced at the darkening sky. Let's pick up the pace. The game trail was rougher, less maintained than the main path. Branches reached across like grasping fingers, scraping against our jackets. The underbrush grew thicker, the silence deeper. No birds called here. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as it moved through the trees. I found myself straining to hear anything beyond our own footsteps, breathing and the occasional crackle of the radio. The forest felt wrong somehow. The silence too complete, as if we'd stepped into a void disguised as wilderness. You feel that? Tom asked quietly, voicing my thoughts. Yeah. No need to elaborate. We'd both been in the backcountry enough times to know when something was off. Keep your eyes open. Another half-mile along the game trail, Tom froze, holding up a hand in a gesture that instantly brought me to a halt. He pointed silently to the ground ahead. Matthew's backpack sat propped against a gnarled pine, looking for all the world like someone had carefully placed it there before walking away. No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to suggest its owner had been in distress. Teague. Tom's voice was unnaturally tight. Look at this. He was staring at the trunk of the tree above the backpack. Carved into the bark was a symbol. The same spiral with radiating lines that Matthews had doodled on the trailhead register. I keyed my radio. Dispatch, we've located subject's pack approximately 5 miles in, on an unmarked trail northeast of Weatherford Junction. No visual on subject yet. Over. Copy that, Teague. Proceed with caution. Weather's deteriorating faster than expected. Over. I looked up at the sky visible through the canopy. The clouds had taken on a strange yellowish tinge at their edges, an unnatural color that sent another chill down my spine. Tom was already examining the backpack, his movements methodical. Water, energy bars, first aid kit, basic stuff, all here. He pulled out a map, a cheap tourist version sold in town, with minimal detail and no topographical information. Christ, he might as well have been using a napkin sketch to navigate. Anything else? I asked, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of Matthews. Tom hesitated, then pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. This looks personal. In our line of work, you sometimes have to violate privacy to save lives. I nodded for him to open it. The first few pages contained what looked like normal journal entries. Observations about Flagstaff, notes about hiking gear, a few complaints about work back in California. But around page 7, the writing changed. The neat, orderly handwriting became increasingly erratic. The sentences fragmented. October 17. Heard something last night in hotel room. Like breathing but not human. Thought it was the heating system, but it followed me into dreams. October 18. The symbol again today. Saw it on a rock, carved in. Same as the one I've been drawing. Why do I keep drawing it? October 19 next morning. It knows I'm coming. It's been waiting. The forest speaks if you listen with more than ears. The last entry, dated that morning, contained only one sentence. I understand now. I have to go to it. The remaining pages were filled with the spiral symbol, drawn over and over with increasing precision, some taking up entire pages, others clustered in groups. On the final page, a detailed drawing showed the spiral encompassing what looked like a human figure, the lines piercing through it like spines. What the hell? I muttered, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Tom's expression was grim. Guy was losing it. Maybe drugs? Psychotic break? I shook my head. I trailed off, unable to articulate the wrongness I felt. Let's keep moving. He can't be far. We continued along the trail, which grew increasingly difficult to follow. The undergrowth seemed to close in behind us as we passed, as if erasing our path. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little light remained. The temperature dropped further, our breath forming clouds in the increasingly frigid air. Neither of us spoke now, communicating only with gestures and looks. Something about this place demanded silence, as if speaking too loudly might wake something better left dormant. After another quarter mile, the trail opened suddenly into a small clearing, perfectly circular, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by pines so densely packed they formed a natural wall. The ground was covered in a carpet of pine needles, undisturbed except for a narrow path leading to the center. And there, in the exact middle of the clearing, sat Devin Matthews. His back was to us, his posture unnaturally straight. He wore the navy blue North Face jacket mentioned in the report, khaki hiking pants, and brand new boots. He wasn't moving, not even the slight rise and fall of shoulders that would indicate breathing. "Devin," I called out, my voice sounding muffled in the strange acoustics of the clearing. "Devin Matthews? Forest Service. We're here to help you." No response. Tom and I exchanged glances. Every instinct honed over decades in search and rescue was screaming danger. But we had a job to do. "Cover me," Tom murmured, unsnapping the holster of his service pistol without drawing it. In 20 years working together, I'd seen him draw that weapon exactly twice. The fact that he was preparing to now spoke volumes. He moved forward slowly, his footfalls nearly silent despite his size. I flanked him, scanning the trees surrounding the clearing. The silence was absolute now. No wind, no birds, no insects. Nothing but the sound of our careful steps on the carpet of needles. "Mr. Matthews," Tom called again when we were about 15 feet from the seated figure. "Sir, we're with the Forest Service. Are you injured?" Still no response. No movement. 10 feet away, the smell hit us. A putrid, sweet odor of rot, and something else. Something chemical and wrong. I fought the urge to gag, pulling my collar up over my nose. "Jesus," Tom whispered, doing the same. At 5 feet away, we could see that Matthew's clothes were damp, darkened with what might have been dew or sweat or something worse. His hair was plastered to his skull, as if he'd been caught in a downpour, except there had been no rain. "Sir." Tom reached out slowly, intending to touch Matthew's shoulder. Before his hand made contact, Matthew's head twitched, a sudden, jerking motion like a malfunctioning robot. It wasn't the movement of anything alive, anything natural. It was mechanical, wrong. We froze. Slowly, with the same jerking, broken motion, Matthew's head began to turn. Not his body, just his head, rotating far beyond what a human neck should allow. I heard Tom's sharp intake of breath as Matthew's face came into view. His eyes were open, unblinking, but there was nothing behind them. No awareness, no humanity. Just empty, glass-like orbs staring at nothing. His skin had taken on a grayish, translucent quality, the veins beneath visible as black, spidery lines. His mouth hung slightly open, a thin strand of dark fluid trailing from the corner. But the most disturbing thing was the symbol, the spiral with radiating lines carved into his forehead, the wounds fresh enough that dark fluid still seeped from them. Before either of us could react, a sound came from behind us, heavy, deliberate footfalls that crushed pine needles with unnatural weight. Something was entering the clearing. We turned in unison, and in that moment I knew my life would forever be divided into before and after what I saw. The thing that stood at the edge of the clearing defied description, yet my mind desperately tried to categorize it, to force it into some recognizable shape. The closest approximation my brain could manage was a bear, a massive, emaciated bear standing unnaturally on its hind legs. But that was where any resemblance to anything natural ended. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin for its body, jointed in places where joints shouldn't exist. The front legs, if you could call them that, nearly dragged on the ground despite its upright posture, ending in appendages that were neither paws nor hands, but something in between, elongated digits tipped with yellowed curved talons that left deep gouges in the earth. Its skin was the worst part. It looked as if it had been flayed, and then stretched back over its frame too tightly, glistening wetly in the dim light, with patches missing entirely to reveal pulsating, blackish muscle beneath. Where the head should have been was a misshapen mass of tissue, with no discernible eyes, just deep weeping sockets that somehow still conveyed the sensation of being watched. The smell that emanated from it was indescribable. Rot and copper and ammonia and something else. Something ancient and wrong that triggered a primal fear response so deep it preceded thought. "Gun," I managed to choke out, but Tom was already drawing his weapon, his movements steady despite the tremor I could see in his jaw. The thing remained motionless, its chest expanding and contracting with wet, labored breaths. Each exhalation released a fine mist of dark particles that hung in the air before slowly drifting to the ground, where the pine needles blackened upon contact. "Back away," Tom said quietly, his gun trained on the creature. "Slow, to the trail." I began to step backward, keeping my eyes fixed on the monstrosity before us. As I moved, something caught my peripheral vision, movement from where Matthews sat. The tech executive's body was rising to its feet with the same jerky, broken motions as before, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. His head remained at that impossible angle, face still turned toward us, empty eyes fixed on nothing. "Tom," I warned, my voice barely above a whisper. He glanced back, his face draining of color as he saw Matthews shambling toward us, arms hanging limp at his sides, head still twisted. The creature at the edge of the clearing let out a sound, then a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in my bones, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. It wasn't a growl or a roar, but something more fundamental, like the sound of reality itself fraying at the edges. Without warning, it lunged, moving with a speed that something so large and misshapen shouldn't possess, covering half the clearing in a single bound. Tom fired. The gunshot was deafening in the unnatural silence of the clearing. The bullet struck the creature squarely in what would be the chest on a normal animal, but it didn't slow, didn't react except to change course slightly, now heading directly for Tom. "Run," Tom shouted, firing again as he began to back away. "Get to the radio." But I couldn't leave him. I pulled the large canister of bear spray from my belt. Useless probably, but the only weapon I had, and moved to flank the creature, trying to draw its attention. It ignored me completely, focused entirely on Tom, who continued firing as he retreated. Each shot should have been fatal, but the creature didn't even flinch. Dark fluid oozed from the entry wounds, but its advance didn't slow. Matthews, meanwhile, had reached the center of the clearing and stopped, his twisted form silhouetted against the darkening sky. His arms slowly raised to his sides, palms up, in a gesture that looked almost like supplication. The air in the clearing began to change, growing heavier, charged with something that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The smell intensified, rot and ozone and copper, as a low thrumming sound began to build from everywhere and nowhere at once. I depressed the trigger on the bear spray, aiming directly at the creature's face-like area. The powerful irritant shot forth in a concentrated stream, enough capsaicin to drop a charging grizzly in its tracks. The creature paused, not in pain but seeming almost curious. It turned those empty sockets toward me, and in that moment, I felt something brush against my mind, a presence, ancient and cold and utterly alien, examining me with the detached interest of a scientist studying a particularly unremarkable specimen. Insufficient. A voice that wasn't a voice seemed to say directly into my thoughts. Not like the other. It turned back to Tom, who had reached the edge of the clearing. His gun clicked empty. The slide locked back. In one fluid motion, he dropped the spent magazine and slammed a fresh one home. But before he could chamber around, the creature closed the distance between them. One elongated limb lashed out, catching Tom across the chest and sending him flying backward into a tree trunk with sickening force. I heard the crack of impact, saw him crumple to the ground, the gun falling from his grasp. "Tom!" I screamed, abandoning caution and rushing toward my fallen partner. The creature paid me no mind, moving to stand over Tom's prone form. It bent down, those long limbs folding in ways that defied anatomical possibility, bringing its featureless face close to Tom's unconscious one. I was halfway across the clearing when Matthews suddenly stepped into my path. His eyes were still empty, but his mouth now stretched in a rictus grin that exposed blackened gums and teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. "He is chosen," Matthews said, his voice wrong layered, as if multiple voices spoke in slightly different tempos. "As I was chosen, as you are not. Get out of my way," I growled, fear giving way to desperate rage. I feinted left, then dove right, trying to get past him to reach Tom. Matthews moved with unexpected speed, grabbing my arm with strength that belied his slender build. His touch burned cold through my jacket, like dry ice against skin. "The spiral opens the way," he intoned, those too many voices reverberating. "The marks are the path. It comes through when called, when the pattern is made." His other hand reached for my face, fingers twisted into impossible angles. "I can show you. I can mark you." I drove my knee up hard, connecting with his midsection, In a normal human, it would have caused immediate collapse. Matthews didn't even flinch, but his grip loosened enough for me to wrench free. I sprinted toward Tom, who lay motionless beneath the looming creature. It had extended one of those terrible not-quite hands, a single talon hovering just above Tom's forehead, poised to carve. Without thinking, I launched myself at the creature, colliding with its side and momentarily disrupting its balance. The smell engulfed me, death and chemicals and something else, something that didn't belong in this world. Up close, I could see that its skin wasn't skin at all, but something more like a semi-translucent membrane, beneath which dark shapes pulsed and writhed. The creature made that humming sound again, the vibration of it rattling my skull. One limb swept around, catching me across the shoulders and sending me sprawling across the clearing floor. Pain exploded through my body as I rolled to a stop near the edge of the trees. Dazed, I pushed myself up on my elbows, vision swimming. The creature had returned its attention to Tom, that talon once again poised above his head. Matthews stood nearby, watching with those empty eyes, his body twitching sporadically. "No," I shouted, struggling to my feet. What happened next saved our lives, though I've never been able to explain it. A massive crack of thunder split the air, followed immediately by a blinding flash of lightning that struck a tree at the edge of the clearing, barely 20 feet from where the creature stood over Tom. The tree exploded in a shower of splinters and flame, the concussion knocking me back to the ground. When my vision cleared, I saw the creature had recoiled from the fire that now licked up the shattered trunk, spreading quickly to the dry underbrush. It made a sound, not the hum from before, but a high, keening wail that pierced my eardrums like physical pain. Matthews, too, seemed affected, his body convulsing as dark fluid leaked from his eyes, nose, and mouth. I didn't waste the opportunity. I scrambled to Tom, relieved to find him breathing, a gash on his forehead but no sign of the spiral mark. I hoisted him up, draping his arm over my shoulders, and began half dragging, half carrying him toward the trail. Behind us, the fire spread with unnatural speed, engulfing nearly half the clearing in moments. The creature paced at the edge of the flames, that keening cry continuing as the fire cut it off from us. Matthews had fallen to his knees, still convulsing, still leaking that dark fluid from every orifice. I should have felt something for him, pity, regret, something. But in that moment, all I felt was a desperate need to get Tom and myself as far away from that clearing as possible. We stumbled down the trail, my muscles screaming under Tom's weight. Behind us, the keening cry gradually faded, replaced by the crackling roar of the wildfire. Rain began to fall, fat, cold drops that hissed as they hit the heated ground. Tom stirred, groaning. "Garrett? What? Don't talk," I gasped, adjusting my grip. "Just help me walk if you can." He got his feet under him, taking some of his weight off me, though he still leaned heavily on my shoulder. Blood ran freely from the gash on his forehead, mixing with the rain to create pale red streams down his face. "Matthews?" he managed to ask as we navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. "Gone," I said simply. There was no other word for it. Whatever Devin Matthews had been, he wasn't human anymore, not in any way that mattered. The rain intensified, a deluge that helped contain the fire but turned the trail into a muddy, treacherous slide. Lightning continued to flash overhead, thunder rolling through the mountains like the voice of some angry god. We were maybe a mile from the clearing when Tom suddenly stiffened. "Garrett," he said, his voice tight. "Look." I followed his gaze. Through the curtain of rain, a figure stood on the trail ahead, the unmistakable silhouette of Devin Matthews, his head still cocked at that impossible angle. "How?" Tom began. "Different way." I cut him off, pulling him toward a narrow deer path that branched off to our left. "Come on." We forced our way through dense underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, the thorns of blackberry vines tearing at our clothes. Behind us, I could hear movement, steady, methodical footsteps following our desperate flight. The deer path eventually joined an old logging road, overgrown and abandoned, but wider and easier to navigate than the game trail. We picked up our pace, the rain plastering our hair to our skulls, soaking through layers of clothing to chill our skin. Tom was recovering quickly, his military training kicking in despite the concussion he likely had. "What the hell was that thing?" he gasped as we jogged along the muddy track. "I don't know," I admitted. but it wanted to mark you like it marked Matthews. Mark me? With that symbol? I nodded grimly. I think that's how it takes people, changes them. Tom's face hardened. We need to report this. Get a team up here, proper equipment. And tell them what? I interrupted. That we found a tourist possessed by some kind of monster that bullets don't affect? They'll think we've lost our minds. Before Tom could respond, a sound cut through the drumming of rain on leaves, that same humming vibration from before. Distant but growing closer. It's still coming, Tom said unnecessarily, his face pale beneath the streaks of blood and rain. We ran. The old logging road twisted down the mountain, becoming increasingly eroded as decades of neglect and seasonal runoff had taken their toll. In places it had collapsed entirely, forcing us to scramble across gaps or slide down muddy embankments. The humming grew louder, closer, no matter how fast we moved. It was toying with us, I realized. It could have caught us at any time, but it was enjoying the chase, savoring our fear. We broke through a stand of aspens and suddenly, mercifully, I recognized where we were. Less than a mile from the main trail. If we could reach it, follow it back to the trailhead. A figure stepped out from behind a tree, directly in our path. Matthews again, but changed even further. His skin had taken on the same translucent quality as the creature's. The veins beneath now black and visibly pulsing. The spiral symbol on his forehead had spread, the lines extending down his face like dark roots. But worst of all, the skin of his torso had split open vertically, revealing a writhing mass of what looked like blackened, glistening tendrils. The spiral opens, he said in that layered voice. I am becoming. You could become too. Tom drew his knife, the only weapon we had left. Stay back, he warned, positioning himself slightly in front of me despite his injuries. Matthews tilted his head, the movement more fluid now, less mechanical. It has existed here longer than your kind has walked upright, he said. It sleeps and wakes, feeds and grows. The spiral is its sign, its gateway. Let us pass, I said, not expecting compliance but needing to try. Matthews smiled, an expression made horrific by his transformed face. You cannot leave. Not now that you've seen. Not now that you know. The humming rose in pitch and intensity, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The rain around us began to fall strangely, drops hanging suspended in the air for moments before continuing their descent. Tom tensed beside me, knife at the ready. Any ideas? He muttered. I had none. Running wasn't an option anymore. Fighting seemed equally futile. We were trapped, with whatever was hunting us closing in from behind and this thing that had once been Devin Matthews blocking our escape route. As if sensing my thoughts, Matthews' smile widened. It comes, he said. The spiral walker, the mark maker. The forest behind us cracked and splintered as something large forced its way through the trees. The humming became a physical presence, vibrating in my chest cavity, making it hard to breathe. Tom and I backed away from Matthews, moving to the edge of the old logging road, where a steep embankment dropped away into mist and rain. No escape that way. A fall would mean broken bones at best, death at worst. Matthews began to change before our eyes, his body elongating, limbs crackling as they stretched and reformed. The split in his torso widened, those black tendrils emerging further, reaching toward us like hungry fingers. And behind us, crashing ever closer, came the creature itself. We were out of options, out of time. Tom met my eyes, a lifetime of friendship and trust conveyed in a single look. Then, with a nod, he turned and charged directly at the transforming Matthews, knife raised. I followed an instant later, understanding his plan without words. Our only chance was to get past this thing, to reach the main trail, civilization, other people. Matthews let out that keening cry as Tom slammed into him, knife plunging into what remained of his chest. Dark fluid erupted from the wound, splattering Tom's face and arms. The tendrils whipped forward, wrapping around Tom's wrist, beginning to sink into his flesh. I grabbed Tom's shoulder, pulling him back with all my strength. The knife remained embedded in Matthew's chest as Tom's hand came free of the tendrils, his skin blistered and smoking where they had touched. Matthew staggered backward from the impact, momentarily off balance. It was the opening we needed. I shoved Tom ahead of me, toward the gap in the trees where the logging road continued. Run, I shouted. Don't stop. We burst past the distracted Matthews, sprinting down the muddy track. Behind us, that keening cry rose again, followed by the renewed crashing of something massive moving through the forest. The logging road dipped sharply, the footing growing treacherous as runoff transformed it into a virtual stream bed. We slipped and slid more than ran, using tree trunks to break our descent where possible. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant as we descended, the terrain perhaps too difficult even for whatever hunted us. Still, we didn't slow, driven by a primal fear that overrode exhaustion and pain. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the logging road intersected the main trail, beautifully maintained, lined with trail markers, a blessed sign of human civilization. We turned downhill, toward the trailhead, moving as fast as our battered bodies would allow. The rain continued to fall, but it seemed normal now, no longer hanging suspended in defiance of gravity. "You think we lost it?" Tom gasped, clutching his injured arm to his chest. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm not stopping to find out." We maintained a brutal pace, passing a few startled day hikers on their way back to the trailhead, who stared at our bloodied, mud-covered appearance with alarm. I ignored their questions, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other, on getting as far from that clearing as possible. The parking lot, when we finally reached it, was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. Our department SUV sat where we'd left it, rain drumming on its roof. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the ignition. As Tom collapsed into the passenger seat, I glanced back at the trailhead one last time. There, at the very edge of the tree line, barely visible through the curtain of rain, stood a figure. Not Matthews this time, but the creature itself, its misshapen form partially concealed by the forest shadows. It made no move to approach, to pursue. It simply watched with those eyeless sockets as I started the engine and threw the SUV into reverse. As we pulled away, I could have sworn I heard that humming once more, felt that alien presence brush against my mind. "Until next time," it seemed to say. The spiral always finds its way. We drove away from the mountains in silence, the only sounds the drum of rain on the roof and the rhythmic swish of the wipers. Neither of us spoke about what we'd seen, what we'd experienced. There were no words adequate to the task. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. Some experiences change you at a fundamental level, altering your perception of reality itself. We had glimpsed something that day that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. Something ancient and patient and utterly alien that had perhaps been there all along, hidden just beyond the veil of what we call reality. And as we descended from the mountains, returning to the world of streetlights and cell phone signals and other human beings, a part of me knew with terrible certainty that we hadn't escaped. We had merely been allowed to leave. The rain followed us all the way back to Flagstaff, drumming on the SUV's roof with monotonous persistence. Neither Tom nor I spoke during the drive. What was there to say? Words seemed inadequate, almost blasphemous in the face of what we'd witnessed. Tom's physical injuries were concerning. The gash on his forehead had mostly stopped bleeding, but would need stitches, and the skin of his right wrist where those tendrils had touched him was blistered and discolored, weeping a clear fluid that smelled faintly of ammonia. He cradled the arm against his chest, jaw clenched against the pain. My own injuries were less visible, but no less real. Every muscle screamed from the desperate flight down the mountain. Bruises were already forming where the creature had struck me, and a persistent ringing in my ears suggested the humming had done some kind of damage. But the worst wounds weren't physical. Something had broken inside both of us up on that mountain. Some fundamental assumption about the nature of reality that could never be repaired. We pulled into the station parking lot just after 6 p.m., the early October darkness already complete, rain-slick asphalt reflecting the fluorescent lights from the building. I cut the engine but made no move to get out, suddenly dreading what came next. "What do we tell them?" Tom asked, breaking the silence for the first time since our escape. I stared through the rain-streaked windshield. "The truth?" Tom gave a humorless laugh. "You want to tell Sandoval we found Matthews possessed by some kind of, what, demon? Alien? That there's a monster up there carving symbols into people's heads and turning them into puppets?" Put like that, it sounded insane. I knew how this would go. They'd attribute our injuries and wild story to a bear attack, or maybe even suspect we'd ingested some kind of hallucinogenic plant. We'd be put on administrative leave, sent for psych evaluations, possibly never cleared to return to duty. We fell, I said finally. Loose scree on the trail. We found signs that Matthews had been there but no body. The storm forced us to turn back before we could complete the search. Tom's eyes met mine, and I saw the conflict there. The professional need to report accurately warring with the knowledge that the truth would destroy us. His pack, Tom said. We have to account for finding his pack. We found it abandoned. Animal predation is the likely explanation for why Matthews himself wasn't there. Tom nodded slowly. And my wrist. The medical team will have questions. I glanced at the blistered skin. Chemical burn. You fell against a plant, devil's club or stinging nettle. Something you had a bad reaction to. It was a flimsy explanation, but it might hold. At least long enough for us to process what had happened, to decide what to do next. I don't like lying, Tom said quietly. Neither do I admitted. But who would believe us? Would you if someone came to you with this story? He sighed, wincing as the movement aggravated his injuries. No, I wouldn't. So we stick with the fall. The empty pack. Forced retreat due to weather. And Matthews? I hesitated. Whatever had happened to Devin Matthews, the man we'd encountered in that clearing wasn't human anymore. But officially, he was still a missing person. Someone whose family deserved closure. Missing, I said finally. Presumed dead from exposure and animal predation. We can push for another search when the weather clears, but I trailed off, the unspoken hanging between us. Neither of us wanted to go back up there, ever. Tom nodded, his expression grim. Okay, the fall, the pack, the weather. He opened his door, grimacing as he eased his injured body out of the seat. But Garrett. Yeah? That thing is still up there, and I don't think it's finished. I had no answer for that. Captain Sandoval was skeptical of our story, as expected, but with the storm intensifying outside and both of us clearly injured, she didn't press too hard. The medical team cleaned and stitched Tom's head wound and applied burn dressings to his wrist, attributing the unusual blistering pattern to an allergic reaction. I declined medical attention beyond some ibuprofen for my bruised ribs, eager to get home, to be alone with my thoughts. The debriefing was mercifully brief. Sandoval wanted a full written report by morning, but was willing to let us go for now. A new search team would be assembled once the weather cleared. I didn't have the heart to warn them. Tom and I parted in the parking lot, both of us soaked through despite the brief time between car and building. The rain had intensified further, thunder rolling continuously through the mountains like distant artillery. Get some rest, I told him, not knowing what else to say. He nodded, his eyes haunted in the harsh glare of the parking lot lights. You too, he hesitated, then added. Garrett, do you think it can find us, here? The question sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with my wet clothes or the October night. I don't know, I answered honestly. Tom nodded again, as if I'd confirmed something he already suspected. Without another word, he turned and limped to his truck, moving like a man 3 times his age. The drive to my cabin was a blur, the familiar streets of Flagstaff rendered alien by rain and darkness, and the lens of what I'd experienced. Every shadow seemed to move, every tree by the roadside a potential hiding place for something that shouldn't exist. My cabin, when I finally reached it, offered little comfort. The emptiness that had once felt peaceful now seemed ominous. The shadows too deep, the silence too complete. I moved mechanically through the rooms, turning on every light, checking locks that I knew wouldn't matter if what hunted us decided to come. I stripped off my sodden clothes, leaving them in a heap on the bathroom floor, and stood under the shower until the hot water ran out. The heat couldn't touch the cold that had settled in my core, a chill that seemed to radiate from the inside out. Afterward, I sat at my kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey and a notepad, trying to craft a report that would satisfy Sandoval without revealing the truth. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself drawing the same spiral symbol from Matthew's forehead, from his notebook, from the trailhead register. I tore the page out in horror, crumpled it, and threw it in the trash. Then, as if compelled, I retrieved it, smoothed it out, and stared at it. The lines seemed to pulse slightly, to writhe on the page like living things. The spiral opens the way. The marks are the path. Matthew's words echoed in my mind. What had he meant? What was the spiral? A summoning symbol. A gateway. I drained my glass, poured another. The whiskey did nothing to dull the edge of my fear or the vividness of my memories. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature, felt that alien presence brushing against my mind. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear, and I fell into a restless sleep at the table, head pillowed on my arms, the half-finished report and the drawing of the spiral beneath me. I dreamed of the clearing, of Matthews with his twisted head and split torso, of the creature moving through the trees with that unnatural grace. In the dream, Tom wasn't with me. I was alone, running, the humming growing louder behind me, no matter how fast I moved. I came to a precipice, nowhere to go but down into darkness. When I turned, the creature stood there, those empty sockets somehow conveying amusement. The spiral is everywhere. That not voice said directly into my mind, in the patterns of leaves, in the growth of shells, in the arrangement of stars. It is the shape of becoming. It reached for me with one of those terrible not-quite hands, a talon extended toward my forehead. You are insufficient now, it continued, but you can be improved. The marks will make you suitable. I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The talon pressed against my skin, beginning to carve. The pain was exquisite, clarifying. The spiral opens. The marks are the path. I woke with a strangled cry, knocking over my empty whiskey glass. Early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the table. My neck ached from the awkward sleeping position, my mouth dry and head pounding from the alcohol. For a moment I thought the worst was over. Just a nightmare, a product of trauma and whiskey and exhaustion. Then I saw the paper beneath my arms. The spiral I'd drawn was different now, more complex, with additional lines and patterns I didn't remember adding. And beneath it, in handwriting that wasn't mine, were the words, "The spiral sees you." My phone rang, making me jump. Tom's name flashed on the screen. "Did you feel it?" he asked without preamble when I answered, his voice tight with fear. "Last night, did you feel it looking for us?" I stared at the changed drawing, at those words written in a hand not my own. "Yes," I whispered. "I think it found us." We met at a diner on the outskirts of town, a place neither of us frequented, as if distance from our usual haunts might somehow protect us. Tom looked as bad as I felt, face gray with exhaustion, eyes bloodshot, the bandage on his forehead spotted with fresh blood. He'd brought his own evidence, a series of photographs on his phone showing the burns on his wrist. What had been blisters yesterday had changed overnight, the damaged skin now forming distinct patterns, the beginning of a spiral. "It's spreading," he said, voice low despite the nearly empty diner. "I can feel it like something crawling under my skin." I showed him my drawing, the additions I hadn't made, the message written while I slept. He stared at it for a long moment, then pushed it away as if it might bite. "We have to tell someone," he said. "This thing, whatever it is, it's not going to stop with Matthews or with us." "Who would believe us?" I asked, the same question from yesterday still without an answer. "We have no proof beyond your wrist and my drawing. We'd sound delusional. Then we get proof," Tom said with sudden determination. "We go back up there, but prepared this time. Cameras, weapons, witnesses." "Are you insane?" I hissed. "You want to go back to that clearing? After what happened?" "We're marked now," Tom said, gesturing to his wrist. "It's already found us. Our only chance is to understand what we're dealing with, to find a way to fight it." He had a point, though the thought of returning to that mountain made my stomach turn. If the creature could reach us here, in town, in our homes, then nowhere was safe. At least on the mountain we'd be facing it directly instead of waiting for it to come to us in the night. "Even if I agreed," I said cautiously, "who would we take with us? Who would believe us enough to go?" Tom pulled out his phone again, this time bringing up a web page. "I've been doing some research. There have been other disappearances in those mountains over the years. More than the official records show." He scrolled through a forum dedicated to missing persons cases in northern Arizona. Several threads discussed hikers who had vanished in the San Francisco peaks, often in the same general area where we'd found Matthews. "Some of these people were found," Tom continued, wandering days later with no memory of what happened. "Others were never seen again. But there's a pattern. The disappearances cluster around certain dates. certain phases of the moon. I thought about Matthew's notebook, the progression of his writings, how quickly he had changed from normal to obsessed. You think this thing is, what? Harvesting people? Tom shrugged. I don't know what it's doing, but I found someone who might. He pulled up an email on his phone, showing me the correspondence with someone named Dr. Eleanor Marsh, an anthropologist from Northern Arizona University who specialized in regional folklore and indigenous beliefs. She's documented stories from several tribes about a presence in those mountains, Tom explained. Something ancient that takes people, changes them. The local tribes had rituals to protect themselves, symbols to ward it off. Symbols like the spiral? I asked. Tom nodded. The opposite of it, actually. A counter symbol that disrupts the pattern. She's agreed to meet with us this afternoon. I sat back, mind racing. This was madness, pursuing some folkloric solution to what we'd experienced. And yet what choice did we have? Conventional weapons had proven useless. The authorities would never believe us. We were on our own. Okay, I said finally. We talked to Dr. Marsh. But Tom, if we do go back up there, we need to be sure, because I don't think we'll get a second chance to escape. Tom's face was grim, one hand unconsciously rubbing at the bandaged wrist where the spiral pattern was forming. I know, but I don't think we have a choice anymore. It's found us. It's marked us. We either fight, or we become like Matthews. The memory of Matthew's transformed body, those black tendrils emerging from his split torso, flashed through my mind. I'd rather die, I said quietly. So would I, Tom agreed. So we fight. Dr. Eleanor Marsh was not what I had expected. Instead of the tweed-jacketed academic I'd imagined, she was a practical-looking woman in her 50s. Dressed in hiking clothes and boots, her gray hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She met us in her office at the university, a cramped space overflowing with books, artifacts, and maps. Officers Teague and Greer, she said as we entered, standing to shake our hands. If she noticed how Tom winced when she grasped his injured wrist, she didn't comment. Please sit. Tell me what you experienced on the mountain. We did, taking turns to recount the events of the previous day. I expected skepticism, maybe even alarm at what must have sounded like a shared delusion. Instead, Dr. Marsh listened with intense focus, occasionally making notes but never interrupting. When we finished, she was silent for a long moment, then stood and pulled a large leather-bound book from a shelf behind her desk. She opened it to a marked page and turned it toward us. Is this what you saw? She asked. The page contained a drawing, crude by modern standards but chillingly accurate in its depiction of the creature from the clearing. The elongated limbs, the eyeless face, the too thin body with its glistening skin. Beneath the drawing were symbols, including the spiral we had come to fear. Yes, Tom whispered, face pale. That's it. What is it? Dr. Marsh sighed, closing the book. It has many names in different traditions. The Hopi called it Tsipopatit, the hungry one. The Navajo knew it as Yetso, a monster that devours. White settlers who encountered it called it the Skinwalker, though that's a misappropriation of a different concept. But what is it? I pressed. Some kind of animal? A spirit? Neither, she said, her expression grave. Based on my research, it appears to be something much older than human presence in these mountains. Something that perhaps was here before this was even a mountain. She pulled out another book, this one newer, filled with her own notes and photographs. The earliest rock art in this region, dating back thousands of years, contains warnings about it. The spiral symbol appears consistently, a mark of its presence, its ownership. Ownership of what? Tom asked. Territory, initially, Dr. Marsh explained. But more importantly, ownership of those it takes. The spiral is a brand, a way of marking what belongs to it. I thought of the symbol appearing in my drawing, of the pattern forming on Tom's wrist. We're being claimed, I said, the words hollow in my mouth. Yes, she confirmed. But you're still here, still yourselves. That's significant. Most who encounter it directly don't retain their autonomy for long. Matthews, Tom said. He changed so quickly. He was receptive. Dr. Marsh nodded. Some people are more compatible with the change. Others resist naturally. How do we stop it? I asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. How do we remove these marks? Dr. Marsh's expression grew more serious. That's the difficult part. According to the traditions I've studied, once the marking begins, it can only be stopped by destroying the source, the entity itself. We shot it, Tom said, multiple times. It didn't even slow down. Physical weapons wouldn't affect it, she agreed. It's not entirely here, not in the way we are. It exists partially in what some traditions would call the spirit world, or what modern physics might term another dimension. Then how do we fight something like that? I demanded, frustration edging my voice. Dr. Marsh pulled out a final book, this one bound in what looked like very old leather. The pages were brittle, covered in handwritten text and drawings. This journal belonged to a Jesuit missionary who came to this region in the late 1700s. He encountered the entity and survived to document his experience. She turned to a marked page. He describes a ritual, combining elements from Christian practices and indigenous traditions, a way to force the entity fully into our reality, making it vulnerable. A ritual, I repeated skeptically. Like an exorcism? In a sense, she nodded. But this isn't a demon in the Christian understanding. It's something outside that framework entirely. The ritual creates a convergence, for lack of a better term. A point where its reality and ours fully overlap, making it subject to our physical laws. And then we can kill it? Tom asked. Theoretically, Dr. Marsh said. But it would require returning to the place where you encountered it. The clearing you described is likely a natural convergence point, a place where the barrier between realities is already thin. My stomach turned at the thought of going back there. And if we don't do this ritual, if we just try to live with these marks? Dr. Marsh's expression was compassionate but unflinching. Based on historical accounts, those who are marked eventually transform completely. They become extensions of the entity, drawn back to it, used to mark others. The process seems to take anywhere from days to weeks depending on the individual's resistance. Like Matthews, Tom said quietly. Yes, she confirmed. And once the transformation is complete, there's no reversing it. We sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of our situation sinking in. Either return to the mountain and face that thing again, with only a centuries-old ritual as protection, or slowly transform into something inhuman, something that would be used to spread this infection to others. We'll need your help, I said finally, to perform this ritual. Dr. Marsh nodded solemnly. I've spent my career studying these accounts, these traditions. I've always wondered if they were merely folklore or something more. Now I know. She took a deep breath. I'll help you, but we need to move quickly. According to the accounts, the marks spread faster once they've taken hold. Tom unconsciously rubbed at his bandaged wrist again. How soon? Tomorrow, she said. The lunar phase is right. And, she hesitated. The longer we wait, the stronger its hold on you will become. Tomorrow then, I agreed, feeling a strange mix of terror and relief at having a plan, no matter how desperate. Dr. Marsh began gathering books and notes. I'll prepare what we need for the ritual. Meet me at my house at dawn. She wrote her address on a slip of paper and handed it to me. And officers, don't sleep if you can avoid it. Sleep deepens its connection to you. As we left her office, the reality of what we were planning hit me. We were going to return to that clearing, to face that creature again, armed with nothing but an ancient ritual that might not even work. Are we really doing this? I asked Tom as we walked to the parking lot. He pulled back his sleeve, unwrapping the bandage on his wrist. The burn had changed again, the spiral pattern now clearly visible, the lines darker and more defined than just hours before. Around the edges his veins had darkened, thin black lines extending several inches up his arm. Do we have a choice? He asked simply. We didn't. We both knew it. Whatever happened on that mountain tomorrow, it would end there, one way or another. Sleep was out of the question. I didn't need Dr. Marsh's warning to know that closing my eyes would invite that presence back into my mind. Instead, I spent the night preparing, cleaning my service weapon. Futile as it had proven before, gathering extra flashlights, batteries, first aid supplies, anything that gave the illusion of control, of readiness. The spiral drawing sat on my kitchen table, a focus for my fear and determination. I didn't touch it again, but I could swear the lines continued to shift subtly when I wasn't looking directly at it, becoming more complex, more complete. Around 2 a.m., Tom called.
It's spreading,
he said without preamble, his voice tight with pain. Up my arm now, past the elbow. Are you sure we should wait until morning? I asked, glancing at the drawing on my table. If it's accelerating. Marsh was clear about the timing. Tom cut me off. Dawn is when the boundary is thinnest. We go then. Okay, I agreed. Though every instinct screamed to act now, to do something rather than wait helplessly. How are you holding up otherwise? A pause. I can hear it, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. When I close my eyes even for a moment, that humming, and voices, not words exactly, but communication, is trying to show me things, Garrett, things I don't want to see. A chill ran through me. Don't listen, I said, knowing how inadequate the advice was. Focus on something else. Anything else. I'm trying. Another pause. Did you write the report for Sandoval? The official report seemed absurdly trivial now, but I appreciated the change of subject. Yeah, stuck to our story. Weather, empty pack, forced retreat. Good. I could hear him moving around, restless. Garrett, if this doesn't work tomorrow, if I don't make it back. Don't, I interrupted. We're both coming back. But if I don't, he persisted. Or if I change, like Matthews promised me you'll do what needs to be done. The implication was clear. If Tom transformed, he wanted me to end it. To end him. It won't come to that, I said firmly. Promise me, he insisted, his voice suddenly hard. I'd do the same for you. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of 20 years of friendship, of trust. I promise, I said finally, but it won't come to that. Let's hope not, he replied, some of the tension leaving his voice. See you at dawn. After hanging up, I sat in my silent kitchen, the clock ticking away the hours until morning. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. The mountains loomed in the distance, invisible in the darkness but ever present, a weight on the edge of perception. I found myself thinking about all the times I'd gone into those mountains without fear. The hundreds of rescues, the training exercises, the occasional solo hikes on my days off. They had been a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the complexities of human society fell away, leaving only the elemental challenges of survival and navigation. Now they were something else entirely. A dwelling place for something ancient and malevolent. Something that had perhaps always been there, watching as we played in its domain, confident in our mastery of the wilderness. How arrogant we had been. How blind. Dawn broke with painful slowness. The sky transitioning from black to deep blue to a pale, watery gray. I arrived at Dr. Marsh's address, a modest house on the outskirts of town, backed by forest, just as the first direct sunlight crested the eastern horizon. Tom was already there, his truck parked in the gravel driveway. When he stepped out to meet me, I barely recognized him. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. He moved stiffly, keeping his right arm close to his body. "Let me see," I said by way of greeting. Wordlessly, he rolled up his sleeve. The spiral pattern now extended well past his elbow, the lines black and raised like scar tissue. The veins around it had darkened to the same color, creating a network of black lines that reached nearly to his shoulder. The skin between these lines had taken on a grayish, translucent quality.
Jesus, Tom.
I breathed. It grew all night, he said flatly. I can feel it changing things. Inside. Before I could respond, the front door opened, and Dr. Marsh stepped out. She wore hiking clothes similar to yesterday's, but carried a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of glass containers. "You made it," she said, eyes quickly assessing Tom's condition. "Good. We need to move quickly." She led us to her vehicle, an aging but well-maintained Jeep Cherokee, with off-road tires and a roof rack loaded with equipment. As we loaded our gear, she outlined the plan. "We'll approach from the east side of the mountain," she explained. "There's an old mining road that will get us within a mile of the clearing. Less chance of being seen or stopped by other Forest Service personnel." I nodded. The last thing we needed was to run into colleagues who would question why we were returning to a search area we'd officially abandoned due to weather. "What exactly does this ritual involve?" Tom asked as we climbed into the Jeep, his voice tight with pain or fear or both. Dr. Marsh started the engine before answering. "It's a combination of elements from different traditions. The Jesuit missionary adapted indigenous practices and combined them with Christian symbolism, creating something unique. But what do we actually do?" I pressed as we pulled away from the house. She glanced at me in the rearview mirror. We create a counterpoint to the spiral, a symbol that disrupts its pattern. Then we use blood willingly given to bind the entity to our reality. Blood. Tom looked alarmed. How much blood? Not a dangerous amount, she assured him. Just enough to seal the working. Once the entity is fully present in our reality, conventional weapons should affect it. Should, I repeated skeptically. This has only been done successfully once that I know of, Dr. Marsh admitted, by the missionary who documented it, but the principles are sound across multiple traditions. It wasn't exactly reassuring, but it was all we had. The drive to the eastern side of the San Francisco peaks took nearly an hour, much of it on increasingly rough roads. The Jeep handled the terrain admirably, climbing old logging tracks overgrown with brush and eroded by decades of rain. As we ascended, I felt a growing pressure behind my eyes, a subtle but persistent awareness of being watched. From Tom's increasingly tense posture beside me, I guessed he felt it too. "It knows we're coming," he said suddenly, voicing what we were all thinking. Dr. Marsh nodded grimly. "Of course it does. It's been aware of us since you first encountered it. But that doesn't mean it can stop us." "Why would it need to?" Tom asked bitterly. "It's already winning." He rolled up his sleeve again, revealing that the black lines had spread further, now reaching his collarbone. Dr. Marsh's expression remained determined. "It's progressing quickly, but you're still yourself. As long as that's true, we have a chance." We eventually reached the end of the navigable road and continued on foot. Dr. Marsh led the way, moving with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the terrain. Tom and I followed, both of us scanning the forest continuously, weapons ready despite their proven ineffectiveness. The forest felt different in the early morning light, less overtly menacing, but somehow more watchful. The trees seemed to lean inward as we passed, branches reaching a little too far, shadows a little too deep. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, the occasional scurrying of small animals were absent, leaving only the sound of our own breathing and footfalls. "How much further?" Tom asked after we'd hiked for nearly 40 minutes, his voice strained. He was moving more slowly now, occasionally stumbling. "Not far," Dr. Marsh assured him, pausing to check a handheld GPS unit. "The clearing should be just beyond that ridge." We crested the ridge cautiously, dropping to a crouch as the land opened up before us. From this vantage point, we could see the circular clearing where we'd found Matthews, where we'd first encountered the creature. It looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light, a perfect circle of open ground surrounded by dense pine forest, the floor carpeted with brown needles. No sign of the fire that had erupted during our escape, no evidence of the horror we'd witnessed. "It's healed itself," Dr. Marsh murmured. "Erased the damage." "Is that normal?" I asked, the word feeling absurd in context. She shook her head slightly. "The entity shapes its domain to suit its needs. The clearing is an extension of it, in a sense." We watched for several minutes, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that the creature or what remained of Matthews might be present. The clearing remained still, empty. "It's waiting for us," Tom said, certainty in his voice despite its weakness. "It knows why we're here." Dr. Marsh nodded, beginning to unpack items from her canvas bag. "Then we shouldn't disappoint it." She laid out several objects on the ground before us. A leather-bound book similar to the one we'd seen in her office. A bronze bowl with strange symbols etched around its rim. Several small glass bottles containing powders and liquids of various colors. A knife with a bone handle, its blade inscribed with tiny, intricate symbols, and a roll of white cloth. "The ritual has 3 parts," she explained as she arranged these items. "First, we create the counter symbol in the center of the clearing, using these powders." She indicated the glass bottles. "Then we invoke the binding, which draws the entity fully into our reality. Finally, we seal the binding with blood, trapping it here, making it vulnerable." "And then?" I asked. "And then," she said, meeting my eyes steadily, "we destroy it. Conventional weapons, fire, whatever works once it's bound to our plane." Tom leaned against a tree, his breathing labored. The black lines had reached his jaw now, tracing upward along his neck. "We should hurry," he said grimly. Dr. Marsh nodded, handing each of us a small pouch. "Protective measure," she explained. A mixture of herbs and minerals that repel the entity's influence. Keep them close. I tucked the pouch into my shirt pocket, feeling slightly ridiculous but unwilling to discount anything that might help. Tom did the same, wincing as he moved his increasingly stiff right arm. "Ready?" Dr. Marsh asked, gathering the remaining items into her bag. We weren't, not really, but we nodded anyway. The descent into the clearing was tense, every step feeling like we were walking willingly into a trap. The air grew heavier as we approached, thick with that same smell from before, rot and chemicals and something else, something alien. We reached the edge of the clearing without incident, pausing at the tree line. The open space before us remained empty, undisturbed, too empty, too still. Dr. Marsh took a deep breath, then stepped forward, crossing the invisible boundary between forest and clearing. Tom and I followed, weapons drawn, senses straining for any hint of danger. Nothing happened. No sudden appearance of the creature. No sign of Matthews. Just the three of us, standing exposed in the center of a perfect circle of open ground. Morning sunlight filtering through the canopy to create dappled patterns on the pine needle floor. "Let's begin," Dr. Marsh said, kneeling to open her bag again. She handed me the bronze bowl and several of the glass bottles. "Mix these together. The red powder first, then the white, then 3 drops of the clear liquid. Stir it with the bone handle, not your finger." As I followed her instructions, she began to mark out a large circle in the dirt, using the knife to score a deep line. Tom stood guard, his weapon ready despite his weakening condition. The mixture in the bowl turned a deep rusty color and began to give off a pungent odor, like copper and ozone. Dr. Marsh took it from me once the circle was complete, carefully pouring the mixture along the scored line, where it seemed to sink into the earth with unnatural speed. "Now for the counter symbol," she said, retrieving more bottles from her bag. Using different colored powders, she began to create an intricate pattern within the circle. Not a spiral, but something more angular, with sharp lines intersecting in complex geometries. As the pattern took shape, I felt a subtle change in the air around us, a thinning, as if the atmosphere itself was being stretched. Tom felt it too. "Something's happening," he said, voice tight. "It's agitated." The forest around the clearing had gone utterly silent, the quality of the light changing subtly, taking on a yellowish tinge similar to what we'd seen before the storm. The air pressure continued to drop, making my ears pop. Dr. Marsh worked faster, her movements precise despite the increasing disturbance. The counter symbol grew more complex, filling the entire circle with its angular patterns. "Almost ready," she said, adding a final line of deep blue powder. "Now for the binding." She opened the leather-bound book, finding a marked page. The text was in Latin, interspersed with symbols and diagrams similar to the pattern she'd created on the ground. "When I begin the invocation, the entity will respond," she warned us. "It will try to stop us, to break the circle. You must keep it intact, no matter what happens." Tom and I nodded, though I had no idea how we were supposed to fight something that bullets couldn't harm. The weight of my service weapon suddenly felt foolish, inadequate. Dr. Marsh began to read from the book, her voice taking on a rhythmic, chanting quality. The words were unfamiliar, a mixture of Latin and something older, harsher. As she spoke, the powders forming the counter symbol began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with her words. The air in the clearing thickened further, becoming almost difficult to breathe. The yellowish light intensified, casting strange, shifting shadows that moved independently of any physical source. Then the humming began, that same vibrating sound we'd heard before, starting just at the edge of perception and growing steadily louder. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the air itself, from inside my own head. Tom staggered, clutching his marked arm. "It's coming," he gasped. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to move, branches swaying despite the absence of wind. The pine needle floor rippled like water disturbed by an unseen force, and through it all, Dr. Marsh continued her chant, her voice somehow cutting through the increasingly deafening hum. The air at the center of the counter symbol began to distort, to ripple and fold in on itself like fabric being twisted. Within that distortion, something began to take shape, a darkness that had depth, that seemed to extend endlessly inward despite occupying a finite space. "Hold the circle," Dr. Marsh shouted over the humming, which had risen to a painful intensity. I moved to the edge of the marked circle, watching for any disruption to the powder lines. Tom tried to do the same on the opposite side, but collapsed to his knees, the black lines now covering half his face, his right eye clouded with darkness. "Tom," I started toward him. "Stay with the circle," he shouted, his voice distorted, layered with something else. "I'm holding on. Do your job." I reluctantly returned to my position, torn between duty to our mission and concern for my partner. The distortion at the center of the symbol continued to grow, to deepen, the darkness within it taking on more definite shape. And then, with a sound like reality itself tearing, the creature emerged. It was the same entity we'd encountered before, yet somehow more substantial, more present. The elongated limbs, the eyeless face, the glistening, not quite skin covering its emaciated frame. But now there was a solidity to it that hadn't been there before, a weight in presence that bent the light around it. It let out that keening cry, a sound so intense it felt like physical pain. Dr. Marsh faltered momentarily in her chanting, blood beginning to trickle from her nose, but she recovered, raising her voice to compete with the creature's wail. The counter symbol flared brighter as the creature fully materialized, the glowing lines seeming to constrain it, to bind it to the center of the circle. It thrashed against these invisible constraints, those terrible limbs lashing out but unable to extend beyond the boundary of the symbol. "It's working," I shouted over the cacophony of noise. Dr. Marsh nodded grimly, blood now streaming freely from her nose and ears. She gestured urgently to the bone-handled knife she'd laid aside. "The binding," she called. "It needs to be sealed." I understood what she meant. Blood, willingly given. I grabbed the knife, the bone handle unnaturally warm against my palm. But before I could act, a new figure emerged from the tree line. Devin Matthews, or what remained of him. His transformation had progressed even further since our last encounter. His body was now barely recognizable as human. The torso split completely open to reveal that mass of writhing black tendrils. His face was a ruin, the skin stretched and torn around the spiral symbol carved into his forehead, which now glowed with the same sickly yellow light as the distortion. "The spiral claims," he said in that layered voice, moving with jerky, broken motions toward the circle. "The marks are the path." "Stop him," Dr. Marsh shouted. "He'll break the circle." I aimed my weapon at Matthews, hesitating despite knowing that whatever humanity had once existed in him was long gone. In that moment of hesitation, he lurched forward with surprising speed, aiming for a section of the counter symbol near where Tom knelt. Tom saw the danger and reacted instinctively, throwing himself into Matthew's path. They collided with bone-jarring force, rolling across the ground just short of the powder lines. Tom fought with desperate strength, wrestling with a thing that was no longer human, trying to keep it away from the circle. "Finish it," he shouted at me, blood streaming from his nose and ears as the creature's keening cry intensified. I turned back to Dr. Marsh, who had reached the final passages of the ritual. The counter symbol now blazed with blue-white light, the creature at its center seemingly more solid, more present with each word she spoke. "The blood," she gasped between phrases. "Now," I pressed the blade against my palm, grimacing as I drew it across the skin, opening a deep cut that immediately welled with blood. Following Dr. Marsh's urgent gestures, I moved around the circle, letting my blood drip onto specific points of the counter symbol. Where the blood touched the glowing powder, it flashed with intense light, the pattern seeming to solidify, to become more real somehow. The creature's struggles grew more frantic as this process continued, its keening cry rising in pitch until it was almost beyond the range of human hearing. Behind me, Tom and Matthews continued to grapple, moving dangerously close to the edge of the circle. Tom was weakening visibly, the black lines now covering most of his face, but he fought with the determination of a man who knew exactly what was at stake. I completed the circuit, my blood sealing the final point of the counter symbol. The entire pattern flashed with blinding intensity, and the creature's cry cut off abruptly. When my vision cleared, I saw that the entity had changed. It was fully present now, no longer partially transparent or shifting. Its not-quite skin had taken on a more definite texture, the writhing shapes beneath now clearly visible as a complex anatomy, unlike anything terrestrial. The eyeless sockets in its face now held actual orbs, black, glossy things that reflected light like oil slicks. It was bound to our reality. vulnerable at last. "Now," Dr. Marsh shouted, her voice hoarse. "Destroy it while the binding holds." I raised my weapon, aiming at the center mass of the creature. It stared at me with those oil-slick eyes, and I felt that alien presence brush against my mind again, but weaker now, muffled. "You cannot unmake what was never made," it seemed to say. "The spiral is eternal." I fired, emptying my magazine into the creature's body. Unlike before, the bullets didn't pass through harmlessly. They struck with impact, tearing through the membrane-like skin, releasing gouts of dark fluid that sizzled where it touched the ground. The creature shrieked, a sound so painful it drove me to my knees. But I'd heard it. For the first time, we'd heard it. "Fire," Dr. Marsh was shouting, pulling flares from her bag. "Use fire." She tossed me a flare, which I ignited and hurled at the wounded creature. It struck its chest, igniting the fluid seeping from its wounds. Blue-white flames spread rapidly across its body, and its shriek rose to an impossible pitch. At the edge of the circle, Tom had pinned Matthews to the ground, holding him despite his own weakening condition. But as the creature burned, Matthews began to convulse, the black tendrils in his split torso thrashing wildly. "Tom," I shouted, "get away from him." Tom tried to push himself away, but the tendrils suddenly lashed out, wrapping around his arms, his neck. I watched in horror as they began to sink into his flesh, merging with the black lines already spreading beneath his skin. The creature in the center of the circle was fully engulfed now, the unnatural fire consuming it with astonishing speed. As it burned, it began to fold in on itself, collapsing inward like paper crumpling into nothing. Dr. Marsh staggered to my side, her face streaked with blood. "It's working," she gasped. "It's being unmade." But my attention was fixed on Tom, who had stopped struggling against the tendrils. He knelt there, head bowed, as the black corruption from Matthews flowed into him, accelerating the transformation that had already begun. When he looked up, his eyes were solid black, reflecting light like oil slicks. "Tom," I whispered, my heart breaking. He smiled, a terrible echo of the expression I'd seen countless times over 20 years of friendship. "The spiral claims," he said, his voice layered with that alien resonance. "But part of me remains, Garrett. Enough to do what must be done." With a visible effort of will, he lurched to his feet, dragging Matthews with him. The two of them, connected by those writhing tendrils, staggered toward the burning creature at the center of the circle. I realized his intention an instant before he acted. "Tom, no!" But he didn't stop. With a final surge of strength, he threw himself and Matthews directly into the collapsing form of the burning creature. The blue-white flames engulfed all three of them instantly, the light so intense I had to shield my eyes. There was a sound like air rushing into a vacuum, a momentary pressure drop that made my ears pop painfully. Then silence, complete and absolute. When I looked again, the center of the circle was empty. No creature, no Matthews, no Tom. Nothing but a perfectly circular burn mark on the ground, still smoking slightly. The counter symbol had faded, the powders consumed or scattered. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, the yellowish light returning to normal daylight. In the trees surrounding the clearing, birds had begun to sing again. Dr. Marsh collapsed beside me, exhaustion and blood loss taking their toll. "He sacrificed himself," she murmured. "He completed the binding with his own body." I couldn't speak, couldn't process what had just happened. Tom was gone. My partner, my friend, consumed by the same entity he'd helped destroy. "Is it over?" I finally managed to ask. "Is that thing really gone?" Dr. Marsh's expression was grave despite our apparent victory. "Its physical form in our reality is destroyed," she said carefully. "But entities like this, they're persistent. They exist across multiple planes. This manifestation is gone, but it could come back," I finished for her. She nodded slowly. "In time. Years, decades, centuries perhaps. But eventually, yes." I stared at the burn mark where Tom had disappeared, feeling hollow, drained. We'd won, but at such cost, and the victory might be temporary. "We should go," Dr. Marsh said gently, after giving me a moment. "The Forest Service will have seen the smoke. They'll be coming to investigate." I nodded mechanically, helping her to her feet. We gathered what remained of our equipment in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we prepared to leave the clearing, I paused, looking back at that circular burn mark one last time. Something compelled me to approach it, to kneel beside it. In the ashes, barely visible, was a shape, not the spiral, but a simple, rough T drawn in the carbon residue. Tom's last message, perhaps. His way of telling me that some part of him had remained himself until the end. I traced the letter with my finger, feeling the still warm ash. "Goodbye, friend," I whispered. The official report concluded that a lightning strike had caused the small forest fire, consistent with the storm that had passed through the area. The search for Devin Matthews was officially closed. His disappearance attributed to animal predation and exposure. Common, unfortunate, but not suspicious. Tom Greer was listed as killed in the line of duty, caught in the sudden wildfire while conducting a follow-up search. A hero's funeral. A flag-draped coffin, empty of course. His name added to the memorial wall at the ranger station. Dr. Marsh and I never spoke publicly about what really happened. Who would believe us? But we continued to research, to document, to prepare for the day when the spiral might appear again, when the marks might once more become a path. I still work search and rescue, though not in the San Francisco peaks. I transferred to a different district, different mountains. But I keep my eyes open for signs, for spiral symbols carved into trees or rocks, for hikers who disappear without explanation, for any hint that it might be returning. Sometimes, on the edge of sleep, I think I hear that humming again, feel that alien presence brushing against my mind. A reminder, perhaps, that some things are patient, eternal. You can laugh all you want, call me paranoid, but if you ever find yourself hiking in the wilderness and come across a spiral symbol carved into a tree or rock, turn back, leave immediately. Don't follow the marks, don't let them become your path. And whatever you do, don't go alone. Because in my line of work, it's not the hiking that gets you. It's not the rugged trails or the weather. Though that stuff is no picnic either. It's the things that wait in the woods, the things that aren't human, the things that have been waiting since before we walked upright. The things that are still waiting now,